The distinctive bell-shaped pottery vessels that would eventually give their name to an entire prehistoric culture first emerged from European soil in the mid-19th century, when amateur antiquarians and early archaeologists began systematically excavating burial sites across the continent. These curious ceramic containers, with their characteristic inverted bell profile and intricate geometric decorations, appeared with a remarkable consistency in graves from Spain to Hungary, from Scotland to Sicily. The vessels themselves measured typically between 10 and 25 centimetres in height, featuring a wide mouth that tapered to a narrow base, often adorned with horizontal bands of impressed chord markings, hatched patterns, and geometric motifs that demonstrated sophisticated craftsmanship. The term Beaker culture emerged from German archaeological terminology in the 1900s, when scholars began recognizing the widespread distribution of these vessels across Europe. The German word Glockenbecher, meaning bell beaker, captured the essential form of these containers, though the English translation simplified this to the more familiar beaker. Early excavations in Bavaria, the Netherlands, and Britain revealed that these pottery vessels consistently appeared alongside specific artifact assemblages, including copper daggers, stone wrist guards, flint arrowheads, and distinctive V-perforated bone or stone buttons. Initial archaeological interpretations of the Beaker phenomenon reflected the theoretical frameworks dominant in late 19th and early 20th century European archaeology. The prevailing invasion hypothesis proposed that the appearance of Beaker pottery represented the arrival of a new population group that had migrated across Europe, bringing with them advanced metallurgical knowledge and distinctive cultural practices. This theory gained particular traction following excavations at sites like Ciempozuelos near Madrid, where Spanish archaeologist Juan Vilanova y Piera documented elaborate beaker burials containing copper implements that seemed technologically superior to preceding Neolithic assemblages. British archaeologist Lord Abercrombie's seminal 1912 work, A Study of the Bronze Age Pottery of Great Britain and Ireland, established the first comprehensive typological framework for beaker pottery, distinguishing between different stylistic traditions and proposing migration routes from continental Europe to the British Isles. Abercrombie's classification system identified several distinct beaker styles, including the all-over ornamented vessels characterised by complete surface decoration, and the European beakers featuring more restrained geometric patterns concentrated around the vessel's upper portions. The invasion hypothesis received further support from German archaeologist Gustav Kusinner, whose cultural historical approach emphasised the connection between material culture and ethnic identity. Kusinner argued that the rapid appearance of beaker assemblages across Europe indicated the movement of a warrior elite who conquered existing Neolithic populations and imposed their superior technology and social organisation. This interpretation aligned with contemporary European nationalist ideologies and remained influential through the first half of the 20th century. However, subsequent archaeological research gradually revealed the complexity of beaker origins and development. Excavations in the Tagus Estuary region of Portugal during the 1960s and 1970s uncovered some of the earliest known beaker pottery, dating to approximately 2800 BC. These discoveries at sites like Vila Nova de São Pedro demonstrated that beaker traditions had deep roots in Iberian Copper Age communities, suggesting indigenous development rather than external invasion. The Portuguese beakers exhibited sophisticated decorative techniques and appeared alongside advanced copper metallurgy, indicating that beaker culture had emerged from existing late Neolithic populations who had already achieved considerable technological sophistication. The geographic distribution of beaker culture ultimately encompassed an extraordinary territorial range, stretching from the Atlantic shores of Portugal and Morocco in the west to the Carpathian Mountains of Hungary and Romania in the east. Northern expansion reached the Orkney Islands of Scotland and southern Norway, while the southern boundary extended through Mediterranean islands, including Sardinia, Sicily, and the Balearics. This distribution pattern revealed a complex network of cultural exchange that operated across diverse environmental zones, from Atlantic coastal plains to alpine valleys, from Mediterranean hillsides to North European forests. Chronological analysis of radiocarbon dates from Beaker sites across Europe revealed a general west-to-east temporal progression, with the earliest manifestations appearing in Iberia around 2800 BC and subsequent development spreading northward and eastward over the following centuries. The culture reached the Netherlands and Britain by approximately 2500 BC, Central Europe by 2400 BC, and achieved its maximum geographic extent by 2200 BC. This temporal pattern supported theories of cultural diffusion rather than rapid population replacement, suggesting that Beaker traditions spread through existing social networks and trade relationships. The relationship between Beaker culture and preceding Neolithic traditions varied significantly across different regions of Europe. In Iberia, Beaker pottery appeared within established Copper Age settlements, where communities had already developed sophisticated metallurgical techniques and monumental architecture. Sites like Los Millares in southeastern Spain demonstrated clear continuity between late Neolithic and Beaker occupations, with gradual adoption of Beaker pottery styles alongside existing ceramic traditions. The fortified settlement featured complex defensive walls, circular houses, and elaborate collective burial chambers that continued in use throughout the Beaker period. In contrast, the arrival of Beaker culture in Britain represented a more dramatic cultural transformation. The replacement of Neolithic grooved ware pottery by Beaker vessels coincided with significant changes in burial practices, settlement patterns, and material culture. British Neolithic communities had constructed massive ceremonial monuments like Stonehenge and Avebury, emphasising collective ritual activities and communal burial in long barrows. Beaker culture introduced individual burial practices, with single graves containing personal possessions that suggested emerging social hierarchies and individual wealth accumulation. The transition from late Neolithic to early Bronze Age occurred gradually across Europe during the 3rd millennium BC, with Beaker culture playing a crucial role in this transformation. Beaker communities possessed advanced knowledge of copper and gold working, producing sophisticated metal implements including flat axes, daggers, and ornamental items. Archaeological evidence from sites like Amesbury, Archer near Stonehenge, revealed individuals buried with extensive assemblages of metal objects, stone tools, and pottery vessels that demonstrated access to materials and technologies from across Europe. Beaker metallurgy represented a significant technological advancement over preceding Neolithic traditions. Copper objects found in Beaker graves included not only utilitarian implements, but also ceremonial weapons and ornamental items that suggested the emergence of craft specialisation and long-distance trade networks. The famous Amesbury archer, discovered in 2002, was buried with copper daggers, gold hair ornaments, and stone wrist guards that originated from locations hundreds of kilometres apart, indicating sophisticated exchange systems that connected communities across vast distances. The distinctive material culture associated with Beaker burials extended beyond pottery and metalwork to include specialised archery equipment, personal ornaments, and ceremonial objects. Stone wrist guards, typically made from fine-grained sandstone or schist, protected archers' forearms from bowstring recoil and appeared consistently in Beaker graves throughout Europe. These objects displayed remarkable standardization in form and function despite their wide geographic distribution, suggesting shared technological knowledge and cultural practices among Beaker communities. Archaeological investigations during the late 20th and early 21st centuries increasingly emphasized the indigenous development of Beaker culture from existing European populations rather than external invasion or migration. Detailed analysis of settlement patterns, technological traditions, and genetic evidence revealed complex processes of cultural transmission that operated through existing social networks. The beaker phenomenon represented not the arrival of a new population, but the rapid spread of cultural innovations including pottery styles, metallurgical techniques, and burial practices among established European communities. The sophisticated material culture that characterized beaker communities across Europe represented a remarkable synthesis of established Neolithic traditions and revolutionary technological innovations that would fundamentally transform European society during the 3rd millennium BC. Archaeological assemblages from beaker sites reveal craftspeople who possessed extraordinary technical skills in pottery production, metallurgy, stoneworking, and textile manufacture, creating objects that demonstrated both functional efficiency and aesthetic sophistication. These material innovations spread rapidly across the continent through established trade networks and cultural exchange systems, establishing technological foundations that would persist well into the Bronze Age. The distinctive bell beaker pottery that defined this cultural phenomenon represented one of the most sophisticated ceramic traditions in prehistoric Europe. Beaker potters employed advanced manufacturing techniques that produced vessels of exceptional quality and durability. The characteristic bell-shaped profile required precise control of clay preparation, forming methods and firing procedures to achieve the thin walls and elegant proportions that distinguish these containers from contemporary pottery traditions. Archaeological analysis of vessel fragments reveals that beaker potters typically used well-prepared clay tempered with fine sand or crushed rock, creating ceramic bodies that combined strength with workability. The forming process involved sophisticated coiling and paddling techniques that allowed craftspeople to achieve the characteristic inverted bell profile with remarkable consistency. Potters built vessel walls using carefully prepared clay coils, smoothing and shaping the surface with wooden paddles or stone tools to eliminate joint lines and create uniform wall thickness. The narrow base and flaring rim required particular skill to execute properly, as the potter needed to maintain structural integrity while creating the distinctive silhouette that would become the hallmark of beaker culture. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that producing a well-formed bell beaker required considerable experience and technical knowledge, suggesting that pottery production involved specialised craftspeople rather than casual domestic manufacture. Surface decoration represented perhaps the most distinctive aspect of beaker pottery, featuring intricate geometric patterns executed with remarkable precision and artistic sophistication. Decorative techniques included cord impression, comb stamping, incision, and relief moulding, often combined in complex compositions that covered substantial portions of vessel surfaces. Cord mark decoration involved pressing twisted fibre cords into the clay surface before firing, creating parallel lines and geometric patterns that formed horizontal bands around vessel bodies. The cords themselves varied in thickness and twist direction, allowing potters to create subtle variations in texture and pattern density. Comb decoration utilised toothed implements made from bone, wood, or fired clay to create series of parallel lines, dots, and hatch patterns. Archaeological evidence from sites like Durrington Walls in England reveals bone combs with varying tooth spacing that produced different decorative effects when pressed into clay surfaces. These tools allowed craftspeople to execute complex geometric designs, including chevrons, lozenges, crosshatched zones, and intricate border patterns that demonstrated mathematical precision and aesthetic sensibility. Regional variations in beaker pottery styles reflected local preferences and cultural adaptations, while maintaining the fundamental bell-shaped form that unified the tradition across Europe. Iberian beakers typically featured all-over decoration covering the entire vessel surface with intricate geometric patterns, while Dutch and German examples often concentrated decoration in horizontal zones separated by plain bands. British beakers developed distinctive regional characteristics, including the Wessex style, with its emphasis on horizontal line groups and the northern British tradition, featuring more angular geometric patterns. The maritime beaker style, identified primarily in coastal regions of Western Europe, displayed particularly elaborate decorative schemes with complex zonal arrangements and sophisticated pattern combinations. These vessels featured multiple decorative techniques applied in carefully planned compositions that demonstrated advanced understanding of ceramic surface treatment. The decoration often included metal panels containing different geometric motifs separated by vertical dividing lines, creating visual rhythms that enhanced the vessel's aesthetic impact. Central European beaker traditions developed distinctive characteristics that reflected local technological innovations and cultural preferences. Hungarian and Czech beakers often featured relief decoration, created by applying clay strips or pellets to vessel surfaces before firing, producing raised geometric patterns that contrasted with the more common impress techniques used elsewhere. These three-dimensional decorative elements required additional technical skill to execute successfully, as the applied elements needed to bond securely with the vessel body during firing to prevent separation and breakage. The firing process itself represented a critical aspect of beaker pottery technology, requiring careful control of temperature, atmosphere, and cooling rates to achieve desired surface colours and structural integrity. Archaeological evidence suggests that beaker potters employed both open firing and simple kiln structures to achieve firing temperatures between 800 and 900 degrees Celsius. The characteristic orange to reddish-brown surface colours of many beaker vessels resulted from oxidizing firing conditions, while darker grey and black examples indicated reducing atmospheres with limited oxygen availability. Metallurgical advances during the beaker period established technological foundations that would dominate European metalworking for the next millennium. Beaker smiths possessed sophisticated knowledge of copper extraction, alloying and fabrication techniques that enabled production of tools, weapons, and ornamental objects of exceptional quality. Archaeological evidence from sites like Ross Island in Ireland and the Mitterberg region of Austria reveals extensive copper mining operations that supplied raw materials for beaker metalworking across wide geographic areas. Copper extraction involved both surface collection of native copper and systematic mining of copper-bearing ores, including malachite, azurite, and chalcopyrite. Beaker miners employed fire-setting techniques to fracture hard rock, followed by extraction using stone hammers, bone picks, and wooden levers. Mining sites reveal sophisticated understanding of ore geology, with galleries following copper veins deep into mountainsides. The Great Orme Mine in Wales contains over 7 kilometres of Bronze Age tunnels that demonstrate the scale and organisation of Beaker period copper extraction. Smelting technology involved reducing copper ores in simple furnaces constructed from clay and stone. Archaeological excavations at Beaker sites have uncovered furnace remains including clay-lined pits, stone-built hearths, and ceramic crucibles used for melting and refining copper. The smelting process required temperatures exceeding 1000 degrees Celsius, achieved through forced draft systems using bellows made from animal skins. Beaker smiths understood the importance of controlling furnace atmosphere and slag composition to maximise copper recovery and achieve desired metal quality. Copper working techniques included both hot forging and cold hammering to shape implements and weapons. Beaker copper objects display sophisticated understanding of metal properties, with evidence for annealing treatments that softened work-hardened copper and enabled further shaping. Flat axes, one of the most common beaker copper implements, required careful forging to achieve proper blade geometry and hafting arrangements. These tools featured expanded cutting edges created through controlled hammering and grinding, producing implements that significantly exceeded stone tools in cutting efficiency and durability. The development of bronze technology during the later Beaker period represented a crucial metallurgical innovation that transformed tool and weapon production across Europe. Early bronze objects contain varying tin percentages, suggesting experimental approaches to alloy composition as smiths learned to optimize metal properties for different applications. Archaeological analysis reveals that Beaker period bronzes typically contained between 5 and 15% tin, producing alloys that combined improved hardness with enhanced castability compared to pure copper. Beaker daggers represent some of the finest examples of early Bronze Age metalworking, featuring sophisticated blade geometries and elaborate hilting arrangements. These weapons typically measured between 15 and 30 centimeters in length, with flat or slightly ridged blades that tapered to sharp points. The tanged construction required precise forging to create strong hafting attachments that could withstand combat stresses. Decorative elements included incised geometric patterns, gold inlays, and elaborate pommel designs that demonstrated both technical skill and artistic sophistication. Ornamental metalwork during the Beaker period achieved remarkable artistic heights, producing gold and copper objects that displayed extraordinary craftsmanship and aesthetic refinement. The mould cape discovered in Wales represents one of the finest examples of Beaker period goldwork, featuring a ceremonial garment created from a single sheet of gold decorated with intricate repousse patterns. The cape required sophisticated understanding of gold working techniques including annealing, forming and surface decoration to achieve its complex three-dimensional shape and elaborate geometric ornament. Stone tool technology during the Beaker period reached unprecedented levels of sophistication, particularly in the production of specialized implements for archery, cutting, and personal adornment. Beaker flint workers possessed extraordinary knapping skills that enabled production of finely crafted arrowheads, daggers, and scrapers that demonstrated both functional efficiency and aesthetic appeal. Archaeological assemblages reveal standardized tool forms that appeared consistently across wide geographic areas, suggesting shared technological knowledge and cultural practices among Beaker communities. Arrowhead production involved sophisticated pressure flaking techniques that created thin, symmetrical points with sharp edges and strong hafting stems. Beaker arrowheads typically featured triangular or leaf-shaped blades with carefully shaped tangs or stems for attachment to arrow shafts. The finest examples display extraordinary knapping skill, with controlled flake removal that created regular surface patterns and precise edge geometries. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that producing high-quality Beaker arrowheads required years of practice and specialized knowledge of stone fracture mechanics. Flint daggers represented another distinctive element of Beaker stone technology, featuring long, narrow blades that mimicked contemporary copper and bronze weapons. These implements typically measured between 10 and 20 centimeters in length, with carefully shaped hafting areas that enabled secure attachment to wooden or bone handles. The production process involved initial roughing out through percussion flaking, followed by extensive pressure flaking to achieve final blade geometry and surface finish. The most elaborate examples feature surface rippling created through controlled flake removal that produced visually striking patterns across blade surfaces. Wrist guards, also known as bracers, represent one of the most distinctive and widespread elements of Beaker material culture. These rectangular stone plaques, typically measuring between 5 and 15 centimeters in length, protected archers' forearms from bowstring impact while serving as symbols of warrior status and technical skill. Beaker craftspeople produced wrist guards from fine-grained sandstone, schist, and other suitable stone materials, shaping them through grinding and polishing to achieve smooth surfaces and precise dimensions. The manufacturing process involved careful selection of raw materials with appropriate grain size and fracture properties, followed by rough shaping through pecking and grinding. Final finishing required extensive polishing with progressively finer abrasives to achieve the smooth surfaces and rounded edges that characterized completed wrist guards. Perforation for attachment cords involved drilling holes using hollow bone or reed drills with sand abrasive, a technique that required considerable skill to avoid fracturing the stone plaque. Textile production during the Beaker period, while poorly preserved in most archaeological contexts, played a crucial role in daily life and cultural expression. Evidence from waterlogged sites and mineralized textile remains associated with metal objects reveals sophisticated knowledge of fiber processing, spinning, and weaving techniques. Beaker communities utilized both plant and animal fibers, including flax, nettle, wool, and possibly silk from wild silkworms to produce clothing containers and ceremonial textiles. Spinning technology involved wooden spindles weighted with ceramic or stone whorls that enabled production of consistent thread from prepared fibers. Archaeological sites have yielded numerous spindle whorls, displaying decorative patterns that suggest textile production involved both functional and aesthetic considerations. The whorls varied in weight and diameter to accommodate different fiber types and desired thread characteristics, indicating sophisticated understanding of spinning mechanics and thread properties. Weaving equipment included simple frame looms and possibly more complex vertical looms that enabled production of various textile structures and patterns. Loom weights made from fired clay or perforated stones provided tension for warp threads during weaving, while bone or wooden beaters compressed weft threads to create tight, durable fabrics. Textile impressions preserved on pottery surfaces reveal evidence for plain weave, twill, and possibly more complex structures that demonstrated advanced weaving knowledge. The sophisticated material culture that characterized Beaker communities found expression in equally complex settlement patterns that reflected careful adaptation to diverse European landscapes and sophisticated understanding of resource management strategies. Archaeological excavations across Europe have revealed Beaker settlements ranging from small seasonal camps to substantial permanent villages, each displaying architectural innovations and organisational principles that would influence European domestic life for centuries to come. These communities developed distinctive approaches to house construction, village layout and resource exploitation that demonstrated remarkable flexibility in adapting to local environmental conditions while maintaining cultural continuity across vast geographic distances. Beaker domestic architecture displayed considerable regional variation while maintaining certain fundamental characteristics that reflected shared cultural traditions and practical requirements. In the lowland regions of the Netherlands and northern Germany, Beaker communities constructed substantial rectangular timber-framed houses that represented significant advances over preceding Neolithic building traditions. These structures typically measured between 15 and 25 metres in length and 5 to 8 metres in width, featuring robust post and beam construction that could support substantial roof loads and withstand harsh winter weather conditions. The construction process began with careful site selection on well-drained ground with access to fresh water and agricultural land. Builders excavated deep post holes, arranged in parallel rows that define the building's structural framework. The main supporting posts, hewn from oak or other durable timber, measured up to 40 centimetres in diameter and extended 1.5 to 2 metres below ground level to provide stable foundations. Horizontal wall plates connected these vertical supports, creating a rigid framework capable of supporting heavy thatched roofs. Wall construction involved various techniques depending on available materials and local traditions. Wattle and daub panels filled the spaces between structural timbers, creating weather-resistant walls with excellent insulation properties. Craftspeople wove flexible branches or split wood strips between vertical stakes to form wattle panels, then applied layers of clay mixed with straw, dung and other organic materials to create smooth, durable surfaces. The completed walls provided effective protection against wind and rain, while allowing some air circulation to prevent condensation problems. Interior organisation of these longhouses reflected complex social arrangements and functional requirements. Archaeological evidence from sites like Molenaarsgraaf in the Netherlands reveals buildings divided into distinct functional zones, including living areas, storage spaces, and areas for craft activities. The central portion typically contained hearths for cooking and heating, surrounded by areas for food preparation and daily activities. Storage zones occupied the building's ends, where large ceramic vessels and wooden containers held grain, preserved foods, and household equipment. Some longhouses featured internal subdivisions that may have accommodated multiple families or different generations within extended household groups. Partition walls of lighter construction created separate living spaces while maintaining access to shared facilities like hearths and storage areas. This arrangement suggests complex social organisation that balanced individual family needs with collective resource management and mutual support systems. In contrast to the substantial timber architecture of Northern Europe, Beaker communities in Mediterranean regions developed different building traditions, adapted to warmer climates and different resource availability. Sites in Spain and southern France reveal houses constructed from stone foundations with mud brick or adobe walls that provided excellent thermal mass for temperature regulation. These structures typically featured smaller dimensions than northern longhouses, but incorporated sophisticated ventilation systems and shaded outdoor work areas suited to Mediterranean conditions. The hill fort settlement of Los Millares in southeastern Spain demonstrates advanced Beaker period urbanism, with complex defensive walls, circular house foundations, and specialised activity areas. Individual dwellings measured between 3 and 6 metres in diameter, constructed with stone foundations supporting walls of mud brick or rammed earth. Flat roofs created from wooden beams covered with clay and organic materials provided additional living space and areas for food processing activities during favourable weather. British Beaker settlements displayed yet another architectural tradition that combined elements of continental European building techniques with indigenous British practices. Rectangular timber buildings appeared at sites like Durrington Walls, featuring substantial post-hole arrangements that supported structures measuring up to 12 metres in length. These buildings incorporated sophisticated joinery techniques, including mortise and tenon joints that created strong, flexible connections between structural elements. However, many British Beaker sites also contained circular house foundations that reflected continuation of earlier Neolithic building traditions. These round houses typically measured between 4 and 8 metres in diameter, with central hearths surrounded by areas for sleeping, storage, and craft activities. The circular plan provided excellent structural efficiency for supporting conical thatched roofs while creating intimate interior spaces well suited to family life. Underground storage facilities represented another distinctive aspect of Beaker domestic architecture that appeared consistently across different regional traditions. These pit houses or storage cellars provided secure climate-controlled environments for preserving grain, meat, and other perishable foods. Excavations reveal carefully constructed underground chambers lined with stone slabs or wooden planking to prevent moisture infiltration and pest access. The construction of these storage pits required considerable engineering skill to ensure structural stability and waterproofing. Builders excavated cylindrical or bell-shaped chambers up to 3 metres deep and 2 metres in diameter, then lined the walls with carefully fitted stone slabs or split timber planks. Drainage systems channeled groundwater away from storage areas, while sealed covers prevented surface water infiltration. Some examples featured elaborate entrance systems with stepped access and multiple chambers for different storage requirements. Village organisation among Beaker communities reflected sophisticated understanding of social dynamics, resource management, and defensive considerations. Archaeological evidence reveals settlements arranged according to consistent principles that balance individual household needs with collective security and economic cooperation. Most villages featured central open areas used for communal activities, craft production, and livestock management, surrounded by individual household compounds that provided private family spaces. Defensive considerations influenced settlement location and layout in many regions, particularly in areas with evidence for conflict or territorial competition. Hilltop locations provided natural defensive advantages while offering commanding views of surrounding territories. Some settlements featured artificial defensive works, including ditches, palisades, and stone walls that protected residential areas and provided secure refuges during periods of conflict. The organisation of craft production within Beaker settlements reveals emerging specialisation and economic complexity that distinguish these communities from earlier Neolithic villages. Archaeological excavations have identified specialised workshop areas for pottery production, metalworking, flint knapping, and textile manufacture that suggest some individuals devoted significant time to craft activities rather than subsistence production. Pottery production areas typically featured kilns or firing facilities, clay preparation areas, and storage spaces for finished vessels. These workshops often occupied peripheral locations within settlements to minimise fire hazards while maintaining access to raw materials and transportation routes. Excavations at sites like Soest-Velledijk in the Netherlands have revealed pottery production areas with multiple kilns, suggesting coordinated production that exceeded individual household needs and supported trade or exchange activities. Metalworking areas required specialised facilities including furnaces, anvils, and storage for raw materials and finished products. These workshops typically occupied well-ventilated locations with access to fuel supplies and water for quenching and cooling operations. Archaeological evidence reveals sophisticated understanding of metallurgical processes, with purpose-built furnaces designed to achieve the specific temperature and atmosphere conditions for different metalworking operations. The integration of metalworking into Beaker settlements represented a revolutionary development that transformed both technology and social organisation. Copper and bronze production required access to specialised knowledge, raw materials, and equipment that created new forms of economic dependence and social differentiation. Successful metalworkers accumulated wealth and status that distinguished them from other community members, contributing to emerging social hierarchies that would characterise later Bronze Age societies. Subsistence strategies among Beaker communities combined agricultural production with animal husbandry in sophisticated mixed farming systems that maximised resource security and productivity. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites reveals carefully planned agricultural systems that integrated crop cultivation with livestock management to create sustainable food production systems adapted to local environmental conditions. Cereal cultivation formed the foundation of Beaker agricultural systems, with communities growing various wheat and barley varieties suited to different soil types and climatic conditions. Emmer wheat provided reliable yields in marginal soils, while barley tolerated shorter growing seasons and variable precipitation patterns. Archaeological analysis of carbonized grain remains reveals sophisticated understanding of crop selection and management techniques that maximize yields while maintaining genetic diversity for long-term sustainability. Field preparation involved clearing vegetation, breaking soil with wooden ploughs or digging sticks, and creating drainage systems where necessary. Beaker farmers understood the importance of soil fertility management, incorporating animal manure and crop rotation practices to maintain productive agricultural land. Some sites reveal evidence for field boundary systems that defined individual holdings and prevented livestock damage to growing crops. Legume cultivation provided essential protein supplementation and soil fertility enhancement through nitrogen fixation. Archaeological remains include various pea and bean varieties that supplied important nutrients while improving soil conditions for subsequent cereal crops. The integration of legumes into agricultural systems demonstrated sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships and sustainable farming practices. Livestock management represented an equally important component of Beaker subsistence strategies, with communities maintaining diverse animal populations that provided meat, milk, hides, and other essential resources. Cattle formed the primary livestock component in most regions, providing draft power for agricultural operations in addition to food products. Archaeological analysis of bone remains reveals careful management of cattle herds, with evidence for selective breeding and age-specific slaughter patterns that maximised resource yields. Sheep and goats provided wool, milk and meat while requiring less intensive management than cattle. These animals could exploit marginal grazing areas unsuitable for crop cultivation, extending the productive capacity of settlement territories. Seasonal mobility patterns enabled communities to utilise distant pastures during favourable periods, while maintaining animals near settlements during winter months. Pig husbandry provided efficient meat production through conversion of agricultural waste and forest resources into high-quality protein. Archaeological evidence suggests that pigs occupied an important role in Beaker subsistence systems, particularly in forested regions where acorn and other mast crops provided abundant feed resources. Pig management required less labour than other livestock while producing substantial meat yields that could be preserved through smoking and salting techniques. Evidence for seasonal mobility and transhumance patterns emerges from analysis of site distribution, faunal remains, and artefact assemblages across different elevational zones and ecological regions. Many Beaker communities practiced seasonal movement strategies that enabled exploitation of diverse resource zones while avoiding overuse of any particular area. These mobility patterns required sophisticated planning and coordination to ensure successful resource exploitation and community security. Highland summer pastures provided excellent grazing for livestock, while offering access to specialised resources including stone for tool production, metals for craft activities, and seasonal foods like nuts and berries. Archaeological sites in mountainous regions often contain evidence for temporary occupation during summer months, with simple shelters and activity areas that supported pastoral activities and resource collection. Lowland winter settlements provided protection from harsh weather, while offering access to stored foods and permanent facilities for craft production and social activities. These base camps typically featured substantial architecture and extensive storage facilities that supported communities through periods when resource availability was limited. The coordination between highland and lowland sites required sophisticated social organisation and communication systems. Household organisation within Beaker settlements reflected complex social arrangements that balanced individual family autonomy with collective cooperation and resource sharing. Archaeological evidence suggests that most households operated as independent economic units, while participating in larger community networks for mutual support, defence, and specialised activities that required coordinated effort. Individual households typically controlled specific agricultural plots, livestock holdings, and craft production facilities while maintaining access to shared resources, including pastures, water sources, and defensive installations. This arrangement provided economic security for individual families, while enabling communities to respond effectively to external threats or resource shortages through collective action. The organisation of craft specialisation within Beaker settlements reveals emerging economic complexity that distinguished skilled artisans from general subsistence producers. Pottery production required specialised knowledge of clay preparation, forming techniques, and firing procedures that took years to master completely. Successful potters could produce vessels that exceeded their own household needs, creating surplus production for trade or exchange with other communities. Metalworking represented an even more specialised craft that required access to rare raw materials, sophisticated technical knowledge, and expensive equipment. Beaker metalworkers occupied important positions within their communities, controlling access to advanced technology and maintaining trade relationships with distant sources of copper and tin. The products of their workshops became symbols of wealth and status that distinguished successful individuals and families from their neighbours. The transformation of European burial practices during the Beaker period represented one of the most profound cultural shifts in prehistoric archaeology, marking a decisive break from millennia of collective Neolithic tomb construction toward individualised mortuary traditions. that emphasized personal identity, social status, and material wealth. This fundamental change in how communities treated their dead reflected broader social transformations that accompanied the emergence of metallurgy, specialized craft production, and increasingly complex trade networks. Archaeological excavations across Europe have revealed thousands of Beaker burials that provide unprecedented insight into the social organisation, belief systems, and material culture of these pioneering Bronze Age communities. The abandonment of collective burial monuments that had dominated Neolithic Europe for over 2 millennia represented a revolutionary shift in mortuary ideology and social organisation. Megalithic tombs, long barrows, and passage graves had served as focal points for community identity and ancestor veneration, accommodating multiple generations of burials within shared sacred spaces that reinforce collective social bonds. These monuments required enormous communal labour investments and served as territorial markers that defined group boundaries and legitimised land claims through ancestral connections. Beaker burial practices replaced this collective tradition with individual graves that emphasised personal achievement, social status, and material accumulation. Single burials became the dominant mortuary practice across most of Europe, with deceased individuals interred in purpose-built graves accompanied by personal possessions that reflected their social position, craft specialisation, and economic success. This transformation paralleled broader changes in settlement organisation, technological innovation, and economic specialisation that characterised the transition from Neolithic to Bronze Age societies. The earliest individual burials appeared in Iberian Beaker contexts around 2800 BC, initially coexisting with traditional collective tombs before gradually replacing them as the dominant mortuary practice. Portuguese sites like Vila Nova de São Pedro demonstrate this transitional period, where Beaker pottery appeared in both collective megalithic tombs and newly constructed individual graves. The coexistence suggests gradual adoption of new burial customs, rather than sudden replacement, indicating complex social negotiations between traditional and innovative practices. Individual grave construction involved careful site selection and sophisticated excavation techniques that created appropriate settings for elaborate burial ceremonies. Most Beaker graves consisted of rectangular or oval pits measuring between 1.5 and 2.5 metres in length, and 0.5 to 1.5 metres in depth, carefully oriented according to consistent directional principles that varied by region but maintained remarkable local consistency. Western European burials typically followed east-west orientations, with heads positioned toward the west, while Central European examples often featured north-south alignments that reflected different cosmological beliefs or cultural traditions. The excavation process required considerable labour investment, particularly in regions with rocky soils or challenging geological conditions. Archaeological evidence from sites like Amesbury in England reveals graves cut through solid chalk bedrock using antler picks and stone tools, representing substantial time and effort investments that demonstrated the deceased's social importance. The precision of grave construction, with straight walls and level floors, indicates skilled excavation techniques and careful planning that transformed burial preparation into specialised craft activities. Stone cist construction represented the most elaborate form of Beaker's burial architecture, featuring carefully fitted stone slabs that created durable burial chambers, designed to protect the deceased and their grave goods from disturbance. These structures required access to suitable stone materials and sophisticated masonry skills that elevated burial preparation to architectural endeavours comparable to house construction. Scottish examples from sites like Kilmartin Glen demonstrate extraordinary craftsmanship, with precisely fitted capstones weighing several tons that required coordinated lifting and placement techniques. The internal organisation of stone cists reflected careful attention to spatial arrangement and symbolic meaning. Floor surfaces were often paved with flat stones or lined with organic materials including bark, hides or textiles that created appropriate resting places for the deceased. Side walls featured carefully selected stones arranged in regular courses that created visually impressive burial chambers worthy of high-status individuals. Some cists included internal subdivisions or niches for specific grave goods, suggesting ritualized placement of objects according to established ceremonial protocols. Wooden burial chambers represented an alternative to stone construction that appeared particularly in regions with abundant timber resources and established woodworking traditions. Archaeological evidence from waterlogged sites in the Netherlands and Denmark reveals sophisticated wooden coffins and burial chambers that demonstrate advanced carpentry techniques. These structures featured carefully joined planks, fitted lids, and internal fittings that created elaborate containers for the deceased and their possessions. The construction of wooden burial chambers required skilled carpenters who understood timber selection, joinery techniques, and preservation methods necessary to create durable structures. Oak provided the preferred material for most examples, offering natural resistance to decay and sufficient strength for structural requirements. Joints included mortise and tenon connections, wooden pegs, and fitted overlaps that created strong, weatherproof assemblies capable of protecting burials for extended periods. Grave goods analysis has revolutionized understanding of Beaker social organization by revealing clear evidence for social stratification, craft specialization, and long-distance trade networks that connected communities across vast geographic distances. The quantity, quality, and exotic origins of objects deposited in Beaker graves demonstrate emerging social hierarchies that distinguished wealthy elites from ordinary community members through differential access to prestigious materials and specialized craft products. Copper daggers represented the most prestigious category of Beaker grave goods, appearing in approximately 15% of male burials across Europe, but concentrated among individuals who also possessed other high-status objects including gold ornaments, exotic stone tools, and complete pottery sets. These weapons featured sophisticated metallurgical techniques, including controlled alloy composition, precise blade geometry, and elaborate hilting arrangements that demonstrated advanced technical knowledge and substantial labour investment. The finest examples displayed decorative elements, including incised geometric patterns, gold inlays, and carved bone or antler fittings that elevated these objects beyond mere utilitarian tools to symbols of social status and technological mastery. Metallurgical analysis of Beaker copper daggers reveals sophisticated understanding of alloy composition and heat treatment techniques that optimize blade performance for specific functional requirements. Early examples contained pure copper that provided adequate cutting ability, but lacked the hardness necessary for sustained use in demanding applications. Later, developments incorporated tin additions that created true bronze alloys with superior mechanical properties including increased hardness, improved edge retention, and enhanced resistance to corrosion and fatigue failure. The production process for high-quality daggers required access to specialized knowledge, expensive raw materials, and sophisticated workshop facilities that were available only to skilled craftspeople with established trade connections. Copper sources were geographically restricted to specific mining regions, while tin deposits were even rarer and required extensive trade networks to acquire. The combination of these materials in finished daggers represented substantial economic investments that reflected the deceased's wealth and social connections. Gold ornaments in Beaker graves provide compelling evidence for emerging social elites who possessed access to rare materials and specialized craft production. These objects included hair ornaments, dress fasteners, arm rings, and ceremonial items that demonstrated extraordinary technical skill and aesthetic sophistication. The famous Amesbury Archer burial contained gold hair ornaments that originated from sources in Wales or Ireland, indicating trade connections spanning hundreds of kilometres and sophisticated exchange networks that supplied exotic materials to wealthy individuals. The working of gold required specialized techniques including annealing, forming, and surface decoration that transformed raw metal into finished ornaments of exceptional beauty and craftsmanship. Beaker goldsmiths understood the unique properties of gold, including its malleability, resistance to tarnishing, and ability to accept fine decorative details through repoussé and chasing techniques. The resulting objects displayed geometric patterns, naturalistic motifs, and abstract designs that reflected sophisticated artistic traditions and cultural symbolism. Sheet gold working represented one of the most demanding metalworking techniques practiced by Beaker craftspeople, requiring precise hammer control and extensive experience to achieve uniform thickness and smooth surfaces without cracking or tearing. The mould cape from Wales demonstrates the pinnacle of this technology, featuring a ceremonial garment created from a single sheet of gold decorated with intricate repousse patterns that required months of skilled labour to complete. Such objects represented enormous wealth concentrations that distinguished their owners as members of emerging aristocratic classes. Complete beaker sets in elite burials demonstrate the ceremonial importance of pottery vessels and their role in defining social status through control of specialised craft production. These assemblages typically included multiple vessels of different sizes and decorative schemes that suggest coordinated production by skilled potters working according to established artistic traditions. The vessels often display matching decorative motifs, consistent clay preparation techniques, and uniform firing characteristics that indicate workshop production rather than domestic manufacture. The finest pottery sets feature extraordinary decorative sophistication, including multiple technique combinations, complex geometric compositions, and surface treatments that required extensive time investments and specialized knowledge. Cord-marked patterns, comb impressions, and incised designs were combined in elaborate schemes that covered entire vessel surfaces with intricate geometric arrangements. The precision of pattern execution and consistency of decorative elements across vessel sets suggests specialized pottery production by craftspeople who devoted substantial time to mastering complex technical and artistic skills. Regional variations in pottery styles within elite burial assemblages reflect local artistic traditions, while maintaining broader cultural connections that linked beaker communities across Europe. Dutch beakers featured distinctive horizontal zoning with alternating decorated and plain bands, while British examples emphasised linear geometric patterns arranged in complex compositions. These regional characteristics suggest local pottery production centres that served specific territories while participating in broader cultural networks through trade and cultural exchange. Gender differentiation in beaker burial practices reveals complex social organisation that recognised distinct roles and status positions for men and women within these early Bronze Age communities. Archaeological analysis of burial assemblages demonstrates consistent patterns in grave, good associations that reflect gendered activity spheres, social responsibilities, and symbolic meanings attached to different categories of material culture. Male burials typically contained weapon assemblages including copper or flint daggers, stone wrist guards, flint arrowheads, and archery equipment that emphasized warrior identity and hunting prowess. These objects appear together in consistent combinations that suggest standardized masculine identity markers recognized across different regions and cultural groups. The presence of complete archery sets, including bows, arrows, wrist guards, and associated equipment indicates the central importance of archery skills in male social identity and status competition. Wrist guards, found almost exclusively in male burials, represent one of the most distinctive elements of beaker masculine identity. These stone plaques protected archers' forearms from bowstring impact while serving as visible symbols of warrior status and technical skill. The finest examples display extraordinary craftsmanship, including precise shaping, smooth polishing, and decorative elements that elevated these functional objects to prestige items worthy of elite burial contexts. The geographic distribution of wristguards reveals sophisticated trade networks that supplied finished objects or raw materials across vast distances. Jet examples from Yorkshire appear in burials throughout Britain, while distinctive green schist plaques from alpine sources reach sites across Central and Western Europe. This distribution pattern suggests specialised production centres that served regional markets through established exchange networks controlled by elite individuals with extensive social connections. Female burials contained different but equally prestigious assemblages that reflected distinct social roles and status markers within Beaker communities. Jewellery sets, including copper and gold ornaments, elaborate dress fasteners, and decorative pins, appeared consistently in high-status female graves across Europe. These objects demonstrated access to expensive materials and specialised craft production, while serving as visible markers of social position and family wealth. Pottery vessels in female burials often differed from male examples in size, decoration, and functional characteristics. Smaller vessels with fine decorative work appeared more frequently in female graves, possibly reflecting different ceremonial roles or domestic responsibilities. Some female burials contain complete pottery production toolkits, including smoothing stones, decorating implements, and clay preparation equipment that suggests specialised pottery production by skilled female craftspeople. Textile production equipment appeared almost exclusively in female burial contexts, including spindle whirls, loom weights, and processing tools for fibre preparation. These objects indicate the central importance of textile production in female economic activities and social identity. The finest examples display decorative elements and careful craftsmanship that elevated utilitarian tools to prestige objects worthy of burial with high-status individuals. Regional variations in mortuary traditions reflect local cultural adaptations and environmental constraints while maintaining broader Beaker cultural connections. These differences demonstrate the flexibility of Beaker burial practices and their ability to accommodate diverse local conditions and cultural preferences while preserving essential elements of individual burial, ideology, and social stratification. Simple pit graves represented the most common burial form across much of Europe, featuring rectangular excavations without stone lining or elaborate architectural elements. These burials typically contained fewer grave goods than elite examples, but maintained consistent orientational principles and spatial organisation that link them to broader Beaker mortuary traditions. The simplicity of construction made these burials accessible to ordinary community members while preserving essential elements of individual burial ideology. Cremation practices appeared in some regions as alternative treatments that reflected different beliefs about death and afterlife, while maintaining Beaker cultural associations through distinctive pottery and grave good assemblages. Cremated remains were typically placed in ceramic urns, accompanied by personal possessions that had been ritually broken or burned as part of funeral ceremonies. These practices demonstrate the adaptability of Beaker mortuary ideology to accommodate diverse religious beliefs and cultural traditions. The social implications of Beaker burial practices extended far beyond individual mortuary treatment to encompass fundamental changes in social organisation, economic systems, and cultural values that would characterise European societies for millennia to come. The emphasis on individual achievement, material accumulation, and social competition represented revolutionary departures from earlier collective ideologies that had dominated Neolithic Europe. The emergence of sophisticated trade networks during the Beaker period fundamentally transformed European economic and social organisation, creating unprecedented connections between distant communities and facilitating the rapid transmission of technological innovations, artistic styles, and cultural practices across vast geographic distances. Archaeological evidence reveals complex exchange systems that moved raw materials, finished goods, and specialised knowledge throughout Europe with remarkable efficiency, establishing economic foundations that would persist well into the Bronze Age. These networks operated through multiple mechanisms, including direct reciprocal exchange between communities, specialized merchant activities, and elite gift-giving relationships that cemented political alliances and social hierarchies across cultural boundaries. The distribution of copper objects in beaker graves provides compelling evidence for extensive trade networks that connected mining regions with consumption centers hundreds of kilometers away. Metallurgical analysis using lead isotope signatures and trace element compositions has revolutionized understanding of copper procurement and distribution by enabling precise identification of ore sources for finished artifacts. These studies reveal that copper from specific geological formations reached archaeological sites across enormous distances, indicating sophisticated procurement strategies and established transportation routes that operated consistently over multiple centuries. The Ross Island copper mines in southwestern Ireland supplied raw materials for bronze production throughout Britain and parts of continental Europe during the Beaker period. Archaeological excavations at this remote Atlantic location have uncovered extensive mining galleries, processing areas, and settlement remains that demonstrate large-scale extraction operations designed to serve distant markets rather than local consumption needs. The mines featured sophisticated engineering, including drainage systems, ventilation shafts, and structural supports that enabled extraction from depths exceeding 30 meters below ground level. Mining operations at Ross Island required coordinated labor forces and specialized technical knowledge that transformed copper extraction into industrial-scale activities. Workers employed fire-setting techniques to fracture hard rock faces, followed by systematic extraction using stone hammers, bone picks, and wooden levers. The scale of debris accumulation indicates removal of thousands of tons of waste rock to access copper-bearing veins, representing labour investments that could only be justified by extensive trade relationships and guaranteed markets for finished products. The Great Orme mine in Wales represents another major copper source that supplied Beaker period metalworking across Britain and continental Europe. This massive extraction complex contains over 7 kilometres of underground tunnels following copper veins deep into the limestone headland. Archaeological evidence reveals continuous mining activity from the early Bronze Age through Roman times, with peak production occurring during the Beaker period, when demand for copper reached unprecedented levels across European markets. Mining techniques at Great Orme demonstrate sophisticated understanding of geology and engineering principles that enabled efficient extraction from challenging underground conditions. Miners followed copper veins through complex three-dimensional networks that required careful planning and coordination to prevent structural collapse and maintain adequate ventilation. The tunnels feature carefully constructed supports, drainage channels, and access systems that enabled sustained production over multiple generations of mining activity. Continental European copper sources, including the Mitterberg region of Austria and the Ore Mountains along the Czech-German border, supplied raw materials for extensive trade networks that reached from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean. These mining regions featured similar large-scale extraction operations, with evidence for specialized mining communities that devoted primary attention to copper production rather than diversified subsistence activities. The concentration of mining expertise in specific regions created economic specialization that necessitated trade relationships to acquire essential goods, including food, pottery, and other manufactured items. The Mitterberg copper mines demonstrate particularly sophisticated organization, with evidence for standardized extraction techniques, centralized processing facilities, and coordinated distribution systems that supplied finished copper ingots to distant markets. Archaeological excavations have revealed smelting areas with multiple furnaces operating simultaneously, indicating industrial-scale production that exceeded local consumption needs by enormous margins. the standardization of ingot forms and compositions suggests quality control measures designed to maintain consistent products for trade purposes. Tin sources presented even greater challenges for Beaker period metalworkers due to the extreme rarity of cassiterite deposits and the specialized knowledge required for tin extraction and processing. The primary European tin sources included Cornwall in southwestern England, Brittany in northwestern France, and scattered deposits in Central European mountain regions. These limited sources created bottlenecks in bronze production that required extensive trade networks and careful resource management to maintain adequate supplies for metalworking communities across Europe. Cornish tin mining during the Beaker period involved both placer deposits in stream valleys and hard rock extraction from underground workings. Archaeological evidence from sites like Caerlogus demonstrates systematic exploitation of tin-bearing gravels using sophisticated washing and concentration techniques that separated cassiterite from worthless gangue minerals. These operations required detailed knowledge of tin ore characteristics and processing methods that enabled efficient recovery of this crucial alloying element. The transportation of tin from Cornwall to continental European markets required sophisticated logistical arrangements that coordinated maritime shipping, overland transport, and storage facilities across multiple political territories. Archaeological evidence suggests that tin reached Central European bronze production centres through complex trade chains involving multiple intermediaries and exchange transactions. The high value-to-weight ratio of tin made long-distance transport economically viable despite substantial transportation costs and risks. Finished metal objects circulated through different exchange mechanisms than raw materials, often involving direct reciprocal relationships between craftspeople or elite gift-giving ceremonies that cemented social alliances and political agreements. High-status copper daggers, gold ornaments, and elaborate bronze implements appeared in burial contexts far from their production centres, indicating exchange networks that moved prestige goods among wealthy individuals and powerful families across cultural boundaries. The Amesbury Archer burial near Stonehenge contained metal objects that originated from multiple distant sources, including copper from Wales or Ireland, gold from Welsh or Irish sources, and possibly tin from Cornish deposits. This assemblage demonstrates the ability of wealthy individuals to acquire exotic materials through established trade relationships and social connections that spanned enormous geographic distances. The coordination required to assemble such diverse materials suggests sophisticated communication networks and trusted exchange partnerships that operated reliably over extended periods. Pottery distribution patterns revealed different exchange mechanisms that emphasized regional production centers, serving specific territorial markets while maintaining broader cultural connections through stylistic influences and technological innovations. Unlike metal objects that often traveled vast distances as finished products, pottery typically circulated within more restricted geographic ranges due to weight considerations and breakage risks associated with long-distance transport. Regional pottery styles developed distinctive characteristics that reflected local clay sources, decorative traditions, and functional preferences while maintaining broader Beaker cultural connections through shared vessel forms and decorative techniques. Dutch Beaker pottery featured characteristic horizontal zoning with alternating decorated and planed bands that distinguished these products from contemporary British or Iberian examples. These regional variations suggest local production centres that served specific markets while participating in broader cultural networks through stylistic exchange and technological diffusion. The maritime Beaker style demonstrates cultural transmission mechanisms that spread specific decorative traditions across vast geographic areas through coastal navigation routes and established trade relationships. This distinctive pottery tradition appeared consistently in Atlantic coastal regions from Portugal to Scotland, featuring elaborate geometric decorations and standardized vessel forms that suggest direct cultural contacts rather than gradual stylistic diffusion. The rapid appearance of maritime beaker pottery across such extensive territories indicates efficient communication networks and coordinated cultural exchange among coastal communities. Exotic materials including amber, jet, and various ornamental stones circulated through specialized trade networks that connected specific source regions with distant consumption centers. Baltic amber reached archaeological sites throughout Europe during the Beaker period, indicating established trade routes that moved this fossilized resin from northern European sources to Mediterranean markets. The high value and distinctive appearance of amber made it particularly suitable for long-distance trade and elite gift exchange. Amber working required specialized knowledge of material properties and processing techniques that enabled craftspeople to transform raw lumps into finished ornaments and decorative objects. Beaker period, amber workers understood heat treatment methods that improved workability, drilling techniques for creating perforations, and polishing procedures that enhanced surface appearance. The finest amber objects display sophisticated craftsmanship, including complex carved designs, fitted assemblages, and surface treatments that elevated these materials to luxury goods worthy of elite burial contexts. Yorkshire jet provided another exotic material that circulated widely through Beaker period trade networks, reaching archaeological sites throughout Britain and continental Europe. This fossilized wood possessed distinctive black coloration and excellent carving properties that made it highly valued for personal ornaments and ceremonial objects. Jet working required different techniques than amber processing, including cutting, shaping, and polishing methods adapted to the material's specific characteristics. The distribution of jet objects reveals sophisticated trade networks that moved finished products from Yorkshire sources to distant markets through established exchange relationships. Jet wrist guards appeared in beaker burials across Britain, while smaller ornamental items reached continental European sites through cross-channel trade connections. The standardization of jet object forms suggests specialized production centers that manufactured specific product types for trade purposes rather than local consumption. Flint and other stone tool materials circulated through complex procurement networks that supplied high-quality raw materials to communities lacking local sources of suitable knapping stone. Grand Pressigny flint from central France appeared in archaeological sites across Western and Central Europe during the Beaker period, indicating extensive trade networks that moved this distinctive, honey-coloured stone hundreds of kilometres from its source region. The superior knapping qualities of Grand Pressigny flint made it highly valued for producing specialised tools including daggers, arrowheads, and ceremonial implements. The production of the Grand Pressigny flint tools involved specialised knapping techniques that maximised the distinctive material's exceptional qualities while creating standardized product forms suitable for trade distribution. Craftspeople at the source region developed efficient reduction strategies that produced large numbers of finished tools from individual nodules, creating surplus production for export to distant markets. The resulting implements displayed characteristic technical and stylistic attributes that made them easily recognizable as Grand Pressigny products throughout their distribution range. Alpine stone sources provided materials for prestigious axe production that created some of the most extensive trade networks in prehistoric Europe. Jadeite axes from alpine sources appeared in archaeological contexts throughout Western Europe, reaching sites in Britain, Ireland, Denmark, and other distant regions through complex exchange chains that operated over multiple centuries. These implements required specialized geological knowledge to locate suitable raw materials and sophisticated craftsmanship to transform hard stone into finished tools with exceptional functional and aesthetic qualities. The production process for alpine stone axes involved quarrying operations at high-altitude sources, rough shaping at primary workshops, and final finishing at secondary production centres that specialised in creating completed implements for trade distribution. Archaeological evidence reveals workshop sites with extensive debris accumulations that indicate large-scale production designed to serve distant markets rather than local consumption needs. The standardization of axe forms and finishing techniques suggests quality control measures that maintained consistent products for trade purposes. Cultural transmission mechanisms operated through multiple channels, including direct personal contacts between craftspeople, marriage relationships that connected different communities, seasonal gatherings that brought together diverse groups, and specialized trading expeditions that facilitated technology transfer and stylistic exchange. These mechanisms enabled rapid diffusion of innovations including metallurgical techniques, pottery decorating methods, and architectural styles across vast geographic distances. Craft specialization created opportunities for direct knowledge transfer between skilled practitioners who shared technical expertise and artistic traditions through apprenticeship relationships and workshop exchanges. Beaker period metalworkers possessed sophisticated technical knowledge that required years of training to master completely, creating incentives for direct instruction and knowledge sharing between experienced craftspeople and aspiring practitioners. Archaeological evidence suggests that some individuals travelled substantial distances to acquire specialised training or establish workshop relationships with master craftspeople. Marriage alliances between communities provided mechanisms for cultural exchange that transmitted technological knowledge, artistic styles, and social practices across political boundaries. Women who married into distant communities brought with them specialised knowledge, including textile production techniques, pottery decorating traditions, and domestic technologies that enriched local cultural repertoires. Similarly, men who established households in foreign territories contributed technological expertise and artistic traditions from their home communities. Seasonal gatherings, including trade fairs, religious ceremonies, and political meetings, created opportunities for intensive cultural exchange among diverse groups that normally maintained limited contact. These events enabled rapid transmission of innovations and facilitated establishment of new trade relationships and social alliances. Archaeological evidence from sites like Durrington Walls suggests large-scale gatherings that brought together people from across Britain and possibly continental Europe for ceremonial activities and cultural exchange. Evidence for contact with contemporary corded ware peoples reveals complex interaction patterns that included both cooperation and competition between different cultural groups occupying adjacent territories. Corded ware communities in Central and Eastern Europe developed distinctive cultural traditions that shared certain technological innovations with Beaker groups while maintaining separate social identities and territorial boundaries. Archaeological evidence suggests periodic contact between these groups through trade relationships, territorial disputes, and cultural exchange activities. Hybrid artifact assemblages appearing in boundary regions between Beaker and corded ware territories demonstrate cultural mixing and technological transfer between these contemporary groups. Sites in Central Europe contain pottery vessels that combine Beaker and corded ware stylistic elements, indicating direct contact and cultural exchange between communities representing different cultural traditions. These hybrid assemblages suggest complex interaction patterns that included both peaceful exchange and competitive emulation. Battle axes and other weapon forms show evidence for technological transfer between Beaker and corded ware groups, with similar implement types appearing in both cultural contexts, despite different decorative traditions and social meanings. The sharing of weapon technologies suggests military contacts that may have included both cooperative alliances and hostile encounters. Archaeological evidence from fortified sites indicates periodic conflicts between different groups, while burial assemblages suggest warrior ideologies that emphasized martial prowess and territorial control. Early Bronze Age societies that emerged during the later Beaker period inherited and expanded upon established trade networks while developing new exchange mechanisms adapted to changing technological and social conditions. The transition from Copper Age to Bronze Age technologies required more complex procurement strategies due to the need for multiple raw materials, including copper, tin, and various alloying elements that came from widely separated source regions. Wessex culture communities in southern Britain developed particularly sophisticated trade networks that connected British metal sources with continental European markets through cross-channel shipping and overland transport routes. Archaeological evidence from rich burial assemblages demonstrates access to exotic materials, including Baltic amber, Mediterranean gold, and Central European bronze implements that indicate extensive trade connections and cultural contacts across multiple regions. The Bushbarrow burial near Stonehenge contained a remarkable assemblage of exotic objects, including a gold belt plate, bronze daggers with gold hilts, and a ceremonial mace head that originated from multiple distant sources. This burial demonstrates the ability of early Bronze Age elites to acquire luxury goods through established trade networks, while displaying wealth and status through conspicuous consumption of exotic materials. The coordination required to assemble such diverse materials indicates sophisticated economic organisation and reliable exchange relationships. Unetist culture communities in Central Europe developed extensive trade networks that connected alpine copper sources with northern European markets through river transport systems and overland routes. These groups established standardized bronze production techniques and created quality control measures that enabled large-scale manufacturing for trade distribution. Archaeological evidence reveals workshop sites with evidence for coordinated production and standardized product forms that served regional and international markets. The integration of Beaker period trade networks with emerging Bronze Age economic systems created foundations for European commerce that would persist through subsequent millennia. Established transportation routes, trusted exchange relationships, and specialized production centers provided infrastructure for expanded trade activities that supported increasingly complex social organization and technological development. The cultural exchange mechanisms developed during the Beaker period enabled continued innovation and adaptation that characterized European Bronze Age societies. The sophisticated trade networks and cultural exchange systems established during the early Beaker period provided the infrastructure for one of the most remarkable episodes of cultural expansion in European prehistory, as Beaker traditions spread across the continent through complex mechanisms that combined population movement, technological diffusion, and cultural adaptation. Archaeological evidence reveals that this expansion did not follow a simple linear progression from a single origin point, but rather emerged from multiple regional developments that subsequently interconnected through established communication and exchange networks. The complexity of Beaker origins becomes apparent when examining the archaeological record from different European regions, where distinctive local traditions contributed specific elements to the broader cultural synthesis that would eventually span from the Atlantic shores to the Carpathian Mountains. Central European developments played a crucial role in shaping Beaker culture through indigenous innovations that emerged from established late Neolithic communities in the Rhine Valley and surrounding regions. Archaeological excavations at sites like Niederrhein in Germany have revealed early Beaker pottery dating to approximately 2700 BC that displays sophisticated decorative techniques and vessel forms that developed from local ceramic traditions rather than external influences. These early Central European beakers featured distinctive geometric patterns executed through cord impression and comb stamping techniques that reflected established regional artistic traditions, while incorporating new stylistic elements that would become characteristic of broader Beaker culture. The Rhine Valley provided a natural corridor for cultural transmission that connected alpine regions with North Sea coastal areas, facilitating the movement of ideas, materials, and possibly people along established river transport routes. Communities along this river system possessed advanced metallurgical knowledge derived from access to alpine copper sources and had developed sophisticated pottery traditions that provided technological foundations for beaker innovations. The integration of these existing capabilities with new cultural influences created distinctive regional variations that contributed to the overall diversity of beaker traditions across Europe. Simultaneously, independent developments in the Iberian Peninsula created another major centre of beaker innovation that emerged from established Copper Age communities with their own sophisticated technological traditions and social organisation. Portuguese sites like Zambujal and Vila Nova de São Pedro demonstrate continuity between late Neolithic settlements and early beaker occupations, with gradual adoption of new pottery styles and burial practices rather than sudden cultural replacement. These communities possessed advanced metallurgical knowledge and had established extensive trade networks that connected Atlantic coastal regions with Mediterranean markets, providing infrastructure for subsequent beaker expansion. The Tagus estuary region of Portugal contains some of the earliest known beaker pottery, featuring elaborate decorative schemes that combined multiple techniques, including cord marking, incision, and relief decoration in complex geometric compositions. These vessels displayed technical sophistication that required specialized knowledge and considerable time investment, indicating that pottery production had become a specialized craft activity within established social hierarchies. The quality and complexity of early Iberian beaker pottery suggests indigenous development by skilled craftspeople working within existing cultural traditions rather than adoption of foreign innovations. Iberian beaker communities had developed distinctive architectural traditions that included fortified settlements with complex defensive systems, circular house foundations, and specialized activity areas for craft production and storage. Sites like Los Millares in southeastern Spain featured massive stone walls, bastions, and gate structures that protected substantial populations engaged in copper mining, metallurgy, and long-distance trade. These communities possessed organizational capabilities and technological knowledge that enabled them to support specialized craft production and maintain extensive external relationships through established exchange networks. The mechanism of beaker expansion involved multiple processes operating simultaneously across different regions and time periods, creating complex patterns of cultural transmission that varied according to local conditions and existing social organisation. Population movements certainly played a role in some areas, as evidenced by genetic studies that reveal significant demographic changes in certain regions during the Beaker period. However, the archaeological record indicates that cultural diffusion through existing social networks represented an equally important mechanism that enabled rapid transmission of Beaker traditions across vast geographic distances without necessarily involving large-scale population replacement. Marriage alliances between communities provided one mechanism for cultural transmission that could introduce Beaker traditions to new regions through individual relationships that connected different social groups. Women who married into distant communities brought with them knowledge of pottery production techniques, decorative traditions, and social practices that could gradually influence local cultural development. Similarly, men who established households in foreign territories contributed technological expertise and artistic knowledge that enriched existing cultural repertoires and facilitated adoption of new traditions. Craft specialization created opportunities for direct knowledge transfer between skilled practitioners who shared technical expertise through workshop exchanges and apprenticeship relationships. Beaker period metalworkers, potters, and other specialists possessed valuable knowledge that required years of training to master completely, creating incentives for travel and cultural exchange between production centres. Archaeological evidence suggests that some craftspeople established workshops in multiple locations or travelled regularly between different communities to provide specialised services and training. Trade relationships provided another crucial mechanism for cultural transmission that operated through established exchange networks connecting distant communities. Merchants and traders who transported goods across long distances also carried information about new technologies, artistic styles, and social practices that could influence local cultural development. The high value placed on exotic materials and foreign products created demand for cultural innovations that enhanced local prestige and demonstrated connections to distant sources of wealth and power. The chronological sequence of Beaker appearance across Europe reveals complex temporal patterns that reflect the multiple mechanisms involved in cultural transmission and the varying rates of adoption in different regions. Radiocarbon dating from hundreds of Beaker sites demonstrates that the earliest manifestations appeared in Iberia around 2800 BC, followed by developments in southern France and northern Italy by 2700 BC. The culture reached the Netherlands and western Germany by approximately 2600 BC, Britain and Ireland by 2500 BC, and Central Europe by 2400 BC, achieving maximum geographic extent by 2200 BC. However, this general temporal progression masks considerable regional variation in the timing and nature of Beaker adoption that reflected local conditions and cultural preferences. Some regions experienced rapid transformation with sudden appearance of complete Beaker assemblages, while others demonstrated gradual adoption of specific elements over extended periods. The Netherlands provides an example of rapid transformation, where Beaker pottery and associated material culture replaced existing traditions relatively quickly and completely, suggesting significant population movement or rapid cultural adoption by existing communities. In contrast, regions like southern France and northern Italy demonstrated more gradual transitions, with extended periods of cultural mixing where Beaker elements appeared alongside existing traditions before eventually becoming dominant. Sites in these areas contain archaeological layers with hybrid assemblages that combine Beaker pottery with local ceramic traditions, indicating gradual cultural change rather than sudden replacement. This pattern suggests that Beaker adoption occurred through cultural diffusion and selective adoption rather than population replacement in these regions. Britain experienced a particularly dramatic transformation during the Beaker period that involved significant changes in pottery traditions, burial practices, settlement organisation, and material culture. The replacement of Neolithic grooved ware pottery by Beaker vessels coincided with abandonment of causewayed enclosures and long barrow construction in favour of individual burial practices and new forms of ceremonial architecture. Archaeological evidence from sites like Durrington Walls demonstrates clear discontinuity between late Neolithic and early Bronze Age occupations, suggesting substantial cultural transformation that may have involved significant population change. Genetic studies of ancient DNA from British Beaker period burials have revealed evidence for substantial population turnover that supports theories of significant migration from continental Europe. Analysis of skeletal remains from Beaker burials shows genetic signatures that differ markedly from preceding Neolithic populations, while displaying close relationships with contemporary continental European groups. This genetic evidence suggests that Beaker expansion into Britain involves substantial population movement rather than purely cultural diffusion, though the mechanisms and timing of this migration remain subjects of ongoing research. The adaptation of Beaker culture to diverse environmental zones across Europe demonstrates remarkable flexibility and cultural resilience that enabled successful establishment in regions with dramatically different ecological conditions, resource availability, and existing cultural traditions. Mediterranean coastal regions required different subsistence strategies and architectural solutions than Atlantic maritime environments, while Alpine valleys presented unique challenges related to seasonal mobility and resource management. The success of Beaker expansion depended on the ability to adapt core cultural elements to local conditions while maintaining essential characteristics that preserve cultural identity and continuity. Mediterranean adaptations involved modifications to settlement patterns, architectural styles, and subsistence strategies that reflected warmer climates and different resource availability. Beaker communities in southern Spain and southern France developed building techniques using stone foundations and mud brick construction that provided excellent thermal mass for temperature regulation while utilising locally available materials. These structures featured smaller interior spaces than Northern European examples, but incorporated sophisticated ventilation systems and shaded outdoor work areas suited to Mediterranean conditions. Agricultural practices in Mediterranean regions emphasised drought-resistant crops, including barley varieties and legumes that could tolerate variable precipitation patterns and intense summer heat. Beaker communities in these areas developed sophisticated water management systems, including cisterns, channels, and storage facilities that enabled successful agriculture in challenging environmental conditions. Archaeological evidence from sites like Los Millares reveals complex irrigation systems that supported intensive agriculture and sustained substantial populations in semi-arid environments. Atlantic coastal adaptations reflected the opportunities and challenges presented by maritime environments with abundant marine resources but exposure to harsh weather conditions and seasonal storms. Beaker communities along Atlantic shores developed distinctive subsistence strategies that combined agriculture with intensive exploitation of marine resources, including fish, shellfish, and seaweed. Archaeological evidence from shell middens and coastal settlements reveals sophisticated knowledge of marine ecology and seasonal resource availability that enabled sustainable exploitation of coastal environments. Architectural adaptations in Atlantic regions emphasized weather resistance and structural durability necessary to withstand severe storms and high winds. Beaker buildings in Scotland, Ireland, and Atlantic France featured robust stone construction with thick walls and low profiles that minimized wind exposure, while providing excellent protection against driving rain and temperature extremes. These structures often incorporated sophisticated drainage systems and wind-resistant roof designs that reflected generations of experience with challenging coastal conditions. Alpine valley adaptations required solutions to unique challenges related to seasonal mobility, resource management, and environmental constraints imposed by mountainous terrain and harsh winter conditions. Beaker communities in these regions developed transhumance systems that enabled exploitation of diverse ecological zones while avoiding overuse of any particular area. Summer settlements in high pastures provided access to excellent grazing and specialized resources, while winter base camps in protected valleys offered shelter and access to stored foods during harsh weather periods. The architectural solutions developed for alpine environments emphasized portability and seasonal functionality that enabled communities to move efficiently between different elevational zones. Summer shelters featured lightweight construction using organic materials that could be easily transported or reconstructed at different locations, while winter settlements incorporated substantial architecture with excellent insulation and weather protection. Storage facilities played crucial roles in these systems, providing secure environments for preserving foods and equipment during seasonal movements. Northern European adaptations addressed challenges related to shorter growing seasons, harsh winter conditions, and different resource availability compared to southern regions. Beaker communities in Scandinavia, northern Germany, and northern Britain developed agricultural systems that emphasize cold-resistant crops and intensive animal husbandry to maximize food production during limited favorable seasons. Archaeological evidence reveals sophisticated understanding of soil management and crop rotation techniques that maintained productivity despite challenging environmental conditions. Forest management represented another crucial adaptation in heavily wooded northern regions, where Beaker communities developed sustainable exploitation strategies for timber resources, wild foods, and hunting opportunities. These systems balanced agricultural expansion with forest conservation to maintain long-term resource availability while supporting growing populations. archaeological evidence suggests that Beaker communities understood the importance of maintaining forest cover for soil protection, water regulation, and wildlife habitat preservation. Regional variations in material culture reflected these environmental adaptations, while maintaining core Beaker characteristics that preserved cultural identity across diverse ecological zones. Pottery styles adapted to local clay sources and functional requirements while retaining essential decorative traditions and vessel forms that maintained cultural continuity. Tool assemblages varied according to local resource availability and subsistence requirements while preserving essential technological knowledge and production techniques. The success of Beaker cultural expansion across such diverse environmental zones demonstrates sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships and adaptive strategies that enabled sustainable settlement in challenging conditions. This flexibility and resilience provided foundations for subsequent Bronze Age developments that would build upon established Beaker traditions while incorporating new innovations and technological advances. The cultural synthesis achieved during the Beaker period created unified European traditions that transcended environmental boundaries while accommodating local adaptations and preferences. The arrival of Beaker culture in the British Isles around 2500 BC marked one of the most dramatic cultural transformations in the prehistory of these Atlantic archipelagos, fundamentally altering established Neolithic traditions that had persisted for over 2 millennia. Archaeological evidence from across Britain and Ireland reveals that this transformation involved not merely the adoption of new pottery styles or burial practices, but a comprehensive reorganisation of social structures, settlement patterns, and ritual landscapes that would establish foundations for Bronze Age civilization in these regions. The speed and thoroughness of this cultural change distinguishes the British and Irish Beaker phenomenon from the more gradual transitions observed in many continental European regions, suggesting complex processes that combined population movement with rapid cultural adoption by existing communities. The earliest Beaker pottery in Britain appeared in southeastern England around 2500 BC, featuring distinctive vessel forms and decorative schemes that demonstrated direct connections with continental European traditions, while beginning to develop regional characteristics that would distinguish British Beaker culture from its continental counterparts. Archaeological excavations at sites like Newgrange in Ireland and West Kennet Long Barrow in England have revealed Beaker pottery in contexts that clearly post-date the construction and primary use of these Neolithic monuments, indicating that Beaker communities encountered and interacted with existing ceremonial landscapes, rather than establishing entirely new territorial arrangements. The relationship between incoming Beaker traditions and established Neolithic populations represents one of the most complex and contentious aspects of British and Irish prehistory. Genetic analysis of ancient DNA from Beaker period burials has revealed substantial population turnover, particularly in Britain, where isotope studies of skeletal remains indicate that many individuals buried with Beaker assemblages originated from continental European regions rather than local British populations. The famous Amesbury Archer, discovered near Stonehenge in 2002, displayed isotope signatures consistent with origins in Central Europe, while his burial assemblage contained objects from across Western Europe, demonstrating both foreign origins and extensive cultural connections. However, the archaeological record also reveals clear evidence for continuity and interaction between Beaker newcomers and existing Neolithic communities. Sites like Durrington Walls demonstrate complex stratigraphic sequences, where Beaker pottery appeared in contexts that also contained grooved ware ceramics and other Neolithic material culture, suggesting periods of coexistence and cultural mixing rather than sudden replacement. Radiocarbon dating from these mixed contexts indicates overlapping chronologies that extended over several centuries, providing time for gradual cultural integration and technological transfer between different population groups. The interaction between Beaker communities and existing Neolithic monuments created distinctive patterns of landscape use that combined respect for ancestral sacred sites with new forms of ritual expression and territorial organisation. Stonehenge provides the most dramatic example of this relationship, where Beaker period modifications transformed the monument's appearance and function while preserving its essential character as a ceremonial centre. Archaeological excavations have revealed that Beaker communities erected the massive trilithon horseshoe and outer sarsen circle that define the monument's current appearance, representing enormous labour investments that demonstrated both technological capability and cultural commitment to maintaining Stonehenge's sacred status. The transportation and erection of the sarsen stones required sophisticated engineering knowledge and coordinated labour forces that involved multiple communities working together over extended periods. Each trilithon lintel weighs approximately 7 tons and required precise lifting and positioning to create the stable joints that have preserved these structures for over 4,000 years. Archaeological analysis of the mortise and tenon joints reveals sophisticated carpentry techniques adapted to stone construction, indicating that Beaker builders possessed advanced knowledge of structural engineering and stoneworking that enabled them to complete this ambitious architectural project. Beaker period modifications to Stonehenge also included the rearrangement of the bluestones, originally transported from Wales during the late Neolithic period, into new configurations that created more complex internal geometries and sightlines. These changes required detailed understanding of the monument's astronomical alignments and ceremonial functions, suggesting that Beaker communities had acquired knowledge of existing ritual traditions while adapting them to their own cultural requirements. The integration of foreign architectural elements with existing sacred geography demonstrates sophisticated cultural negotiation between different traditions and belief systems. Avebury, the largest stone circle complex in Europe, experienced similar Beaker period modifications that enhanced rather than replaced existing Neolithic ceremonial functions. Archaeological evidence reveals that Beaker communities constructed additional stone settings within the Great Circle and along the associated avenue systems, creating more complex ritual landscapes that accommodated larger gatherings and more elaborate ceremonial activities. The Sanctuary, a complex timber and stone circle connected to Avebury by the West Kennet Avenue, underwent substantial reconstruction during the Beaker period that transformed its appearance while preserving its essential function as a ceremonial focal point. The construction of new henges during the Beaker period demonstrates continued commitment to circular ceremonial architecture, while adapting these monuments to changing ritual requirements and social organisation. Seahenge in Norfolk, constructed around 2049 BC, according to dendrochronological analysis, featured a central inverted oak tree surrounded by a circular timber palisade that created an enclosed sacred space for Beaker period ceremonies. The precise dating of this monument through tree ring analysis provides rare chronological precision for Beaker period ritual construction and demonstrates the continued importance of circular sacred architecture in British Bronze Age culture. Regional British Beaker pottery traditions developed distinctive characteristics that reflected local preferences and technological adaptations, while maintaining essential connections with continental European styles. The Wessex region produced some of the finest British Beaker pottery, featuring elaborate geometric decorations executed through multiple techniques, including cord marking, comb impression, and incised line work. These vessels displayed sophisticated understanding of ceramic technology and artistic composition that required specialised knowledge and considerable time investment to execute successfully. Wessex Beaker pottery featured distinctive horizontal zoning with alternating decorated and plain bands that created visual rhythms across vessel surfaces. The decorated zones typically contained complex geometric patterns including chevrons, lozenges, crosshatch panels, and intricate border designs that demonstrated mathematical precision and aesthetic sophistication. The finest examples combined multiple decorative techniques in carefully planned compositions that covered substantial portions of vessel surfaces with intricate geometric arrangements, that required extraordinary skill and patience to execute properly. Northern British beaker traditions developed different stylistic characteristics that emphasised angular geometric patterns and distinctive rim treatments that distinguished these products from Southern English examples. Scottish beaker pottery often featured more restrained decorative schemes concentrated in specific zones around vessel necks and shoulders, creating different visual effects that reflected regional aesthetic preferences. The clay preparation techniques also varied, with northern potters typically using coarser temper materials that created different surface textures and firing characteristics compared to southern traditions. Irish beaker pottery developed unique regional characteristics that combined continental European influences with indigenous ceramic traditions to create distinctive hybrid styles. The finest Irish examples featured elaborate all-over decoration covering entire vessel surfaces with intricate geometric patterns that demonstrated exceptional artistic skill and cultural sophistication. These vessels often displayed more curvilinear decorative elements than contemporary British examples, possibly reflecting influence from indigenous Irish artistic traditions that emphasised flowing organic forms over rigid geometric compositions. The production of Irish beakers pottery required access to high-quality clay sources and specialised knowledge of firing techniques that enabled creation of thin-walled vessels with complex decorative schemes. Archaeological analysis reveals that Irish potters developed distinctive clay preparation methods that incorporated specific temper materials and processing techniques adapted to local geological conditions. The resulting vessels displayed characteristic surface textures and colours that distinguished Irish beaker pottery from contemporary British and continental European examples. Beaker burial practices in Britain and Ireland demonstrated regional variations while maintaining essential characteristics that linked these traditions with broader European developments. Single burial became the dominant mortuary practice across both islands, replacing the collective burial traditions that had characterised Neolithic communities for over 2 millennia. This transformation represented fundamental changes in social organisation and religious beliefs that emphasised individual identity and personal achievement over collective group membership and ancestral connections. British beaker burials typically featured rectangular grave pits with consistent east-west orientations that reflected shared cosmological beliefs about death and afterlife. Male burials contained characteristic assemblages including copper or bronze daggers, stone wrist guards, flint arrowheads, and complete pottery sets that emphasised warrior identity and technological sophistication. The finest male burials contained elaborate weapon assemblages with multiple daggers, archery equipment and prestigious ornamental items that demonstrated access to exotic materials and specialised craft production. Female beaker burials in Britain contained different but equally prestigious assemblages that reflected distinct social roles and status markers within these communities. Jewellery sets, including copper and gold ornaments, elaborate dress fasteners, and decorative pins appeared consistently in high-status female graves across Britain. These objects demonstrated access to expensive materials and specialised craft production, while serving as visible markers of social position and family wealth that distinguished elite women from ordinary community members. Irish beaker burials displayed distinctive characteristics that reflected local cultural adaptations and different relationships with existing Neolithic populations. Cremation appeared more frequently in Irish contexts than in contemporary British examples, suggesting different beliefs about death and afterlife that may have reflected continuity with earlier indigenous traditions. Irish beaker cremation burials typically featured elaborate ceramic urns accompanied by personal possessions that had been ritually broken or burned as part of funeral ceremonies. The distribution of beaker burial sites across Britain and Ireland reveals complex settlement patterns that combined coastal locations with inland river valleys and upland regions suited to different economic activities and resource exploitation strategies. Coastal sites provided access to maritime resources and transportation routes, that connected British and Irish communities with continental European markets and cultural networks. River valley locations offered fertile agricultural land and freshwater access, while providing natural transportation corridors for moving goods and people across terrestrial landscapes. Upland beaker sites typically featured different characteristics that reflected specialised activities, including seasonal pastoralism, mineral extraction, and ritual functions that required elevated locations with commanding territorial views. The distribution of these sites suggests sophisticated landscape management strategies that integrated different ecological zones into coherent territorial systems that maximised resource availability, while maintaining cultural connections with distant communities through established trade and exchange networks. Archaeological evidence for continuity during the Beaker period emerges from detailed analysis of settlement sequences, technological traditions, and landscape use patterns that reveal complex interactions between incoming cultural influences and existing local practices. Many beaker sites demonstrate stratigraphic continuity, with underlying Neolithic occupations, indicating that cultural change occurred through gradual adoption and adaptation rather than sudden replacement of existing populations and traditions. Technological continuity appears in flint working traditions, where beaker communities continue to produce tools using established knapping techniques, while adapting these methods to create new implement types, including tanged arrowheads and specialised cutting tools. The production methods for these tools demonstrated clear connections with earlier Neolithic traditions, while incorporating innovations that reflected changing functional requirements and aesthetic preferences. Agricultural continuity emerges from analysis of crop remains and field systems that reveal continued cultivation of established cereal varieties, alongside gradual adoption of new crops and farming techniques introduced through beaker cultural networks. The basic agricultural system remained essentially unchanged, with continued emphasis on wheat and barley cultivation, supplemented by legumes and other crops that provided dietary diversity and soil fertility enhancement through nitrogen fixation. Architectural continuity appears in building traditions, where beaker communities adapted existing construction techniques to create new house forms that combine traditional materials and methods with innovative design solutions. Timber-framed construction remained the dominant building technique across much of Britain, while stone construction continued in regions with abundant suitable materials and established masonry traditions. Evidence for change during the Beaker period emerges most clearly in pottery traditions, burial practices, and social organisation that experienced dramatic transformations that established new cultural patterns and symbolic systems. The replacement of grooved ware pottery by beaker vessels represented complete technological and artistic transformation that involved new clay preparation methods, vessel forming techniques, and decorative traditions that required specialised knowledge and training to execute successfully. Social organisation underwent fundamental changes that emphasised individual achievement and material accumulation over collective cooperation and shared resources. The emergence of wealthy burials with extensive gravegood assemblages demonstrates developing social hierarchies that distinguish successful individuals and families from ordinary community members through differential access to exotic materials and specialised craft products. These changes established social patterns that would characterise British and Irish Bronze Age societies for the following millennium. Ritual practices experienced equally dramatic transformations that combined respect for existing sacred landscapes with new ceremonial traditions that reflected changing religious beliefs and social organisation. The continued use of established monuments like Stonehenge and Avebury, alongside construction of new ritual sites, demonstrates complex cultural negotiations between traditional and innovative practices that created hybrid ceremonial systems adapted to changing social and religious requirements. The revolutionary advances in ancient DNA extraction and analysis since the early 2000s have fundamentally transformed our understanding of the Beaker phenomenon. revealing population dynamics far more complex and dramatic than previously imagined through purely archaeological methods. These genetic investigations have uncovered evidence for substantial demographic upheavals during the 3rd millennium BC that varied dramatically across different European regions, with some areas experiencing near-complete population replacement, while others demonstrated cultural adoption with minimal genetic change. The sophisticated laboratory techniques now available enable researchers to extract and sequence DNA from skeletal remains thousands of years old, providing direct evidence for population movements, genetic admixture, and demographic processes that operated during the Beaker period across Europe. Large-scale genomic studies involving hundreds of ancient individuals from Beaker contexts have revealed striking patterns of population turnover that correlate strongly with archaeological evidence for a cultural transformation. The most dramatic demographic changes occurred in Britain, where genetic analysis demonstrates that incoming populations associated with Beaker culture replaced approximately 90% of the existing Neolithic gene pool within a few centuries. This extraordinary level of population replacement represents one of the most complete demographic transitions documented in European prehistory, indicating migration processes of unprecedented scale and impact that fundamentally altered the genetic composition of British populations. The genetic signatures of these incoming populations show clear continental European origins, with closest affinities to contemporary groups from the Netherlands, northern Germany, and adjacent regions of Central Europe. Isotope analysis of teeth and bones from Beaker burials confirms that many individuals spent their childhood years in continental European regions before migrating to Britain, providing direct evidence for substantial population movement rather than purely cultural diffusion. The Amesbury Archer exemplifies this pattern, with isotope signatures indicating origins in Central Europe and a burial assemblage containing objects from across Western Europe, demonstrating both foreign birth and extensive cultural connections. However, the genetic evidence also reveals that this population replacement was not instantaneous, but occurred over several centuries through sustained migration that gradually displaced existing Neolithic populations. Radiocarbon dating from sites with stratigraphic sequences containing both Neolithic and Beaker materials demonstrates overlapping chronologies that extended over 200, 300 years, providing time for interaction, intermarriage, and gradual demographic change rather than sudden conquest and replacement. Some Neolithic genetic lineages persisted in remote regions of Scotland and Ireland, indicating that population replacement was incomplete and geographically variable. The demographic transformation of Britain contrasts sharply with patterns observed in many continental European regions, where Beaker culture spread through existing populations with minimal genetic change. In Iberia, where some of the earliest Beaker pottery appeared, genetic analysis revealed substantial continuity with preceding Copper Age populations, indicating that Beaker traditions developed primarily through indigenous innovation rather than external migration. The sophisticated metallurgy and elaborate pottery that characterized Iberian Beaker culture emerged from established technological traditions and social networks that had developed over centuries within existing communities. Central European regions display intermediate patterns that combine evidence for population movement with substantial genetic continuity from preceding late Neolithic groups. Sites in Germany, Czech Republic, and adjacent areas contain Beaker burials with genetic signatures that include both local ancestry and incoming populations from other European regions. This pattern suggests complex demographic processes that involve migration, intermarriage, and cultural exchange rather than simple population replacement or purely indigenous development. The Netherlands presents a particularly interesting case where genetic evidence supports substantial population change during the Beaker period, but with different patterns than observed in Britain. Dutch Beaker populations show genetic affinities with both local Neolithic groups and incoming populations from Central European regions, suggesting migration processes that involved integration with existing communities rather than complete replacement. Archaeological evidence from Dutch Beaker sites supports this interpretation, with gradual transitions in material culture and settlement patterns that indicate cultural mixing and adaptation rather than sudden transformation. Genetic analysis of female versus male lineages through mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome studies reveals gender-specific patterns in Beaker period population dynamics that provide insights into marriage practices and social organisation. In several regions, mitochondrial DNA shows greater continuity with local Neolithic populations than Y chromosome lineages, suggesting marriage patterns where incoming males acquired local wives while maintaining patrilineal descent systems. This pattern indicates complex social negotiations between incoming and existing populations that involved intermarriage and cultural integration rather than simple conquest or displacement. The relationship between genetic ancestry and cultural practices emerges as one of the most complex aspects of Beaker population dynamics, challenging simple assumptions about the correlation between biological descent and material culture. Individuals with predominantly local Neolithic ancestry appear in burials with complete Beaker assemblages, indicating that cultural identity could be acquired through social mechanisms rather than inherited through biological descent. Conversely, some individuals with incoming genetic signatures were buried with mixed assemblages that combined Beaker and local traditions, suggesting gradual cultural adaptation rather than immediate adoption of new practices. Regional variations in the correlation between genetic ancestry and material culture reflect different mechanisms of cultural transmission and social integration that operated across diverse European contexts. In Britain, the strong correlation between incoming genetic signatures and complete Beaker assemblages supports theories of substantial migration by populations who maintained their cultural traditions in new territories. However, even in Britain, some sites contain individuals with mixed genetic ancestry buried with typical Beaker assemblages, indicating that cultural identity could transcend biological origins through marriage, adoption, or other social mechanisms. The genetic evidence for population movements during the Beaker period provides crucial data for evaluating competing theories about the mechanisms of cultural change in prehistoric Europe. Traditional migration models propose that cultural innovations spread through population movement by groups who carried new technologies and social practices to different regions. Alternative diffusion models emphasize cultural transmission through existing social networks without necessarily involving substantial population movement. The genetic data demonstrates that both mechanisms operated simultaneously, but with different relative importance in different regions and time periods. Strontium isotope analysis of tooth enamel provides additional evidence for individual mobility patterns that complement genetic data about population origins and movements. Teeth form during childhood and preserve isotope signatures from the geological regions where individuals spent their early years, enabling researchers to identify migrants who moved from their birth regions to their burial locations. Studies of Beaker burials across Europe reveal substantial individual mobility that included both local movements within regional territories and long-distance migrations spanning hundreds of kilometres. The famous Boscombe Bowmen burial near Stonehenge contained multiple individuals with isotope signatures indicating origins in Wales or Western Britain, demonstrating regional mobility within the British Isles during the Beaker period. These individuals were buried together with similar assemblages of archery equipment and pottery, suggesting that they travelled as a group and maintained shared cultural practices despite geographic displacement. The coordinated burial arrangement indicates that group mobility was planned and organised rather than representing individual migration decisions. Continental European examples of long-distance mobility include individuals buried in Central European Beaker contexts, with isotope signatures indicating origins in alpine regions or Mediterranean coastal areas. These cases demonstrate that individual mobility operated across cultural boundaries and involved movement between regions. With different environmental conditions and subsistence strategies, the successful integration of these migrants into distant communities required cultural adaptation and social negotiation that enabled maintenance of personal identity while adopting local practices and customs. The genetic evidence for admixture between different populations during the Beaker period reveals complex demographic processes that involved gradual integration rather than simple replacement or isolation. Admixture analysis demonstrates that most Beaker period individuals possessed ancestry from multiple source populations, indicating sustained contact and intermarriage between groups with different genetic backgrounds. The proportions of different ancestral components varied geographically and chronologically, reflecting the intensity and duration of contact between different populations. Early Beaker period individuals typically show less admixture than later examples, suggesting that initial migrations involved relatively discrete population groups that subsequently mixed with local populations over multiple generations. Later Beaker period burials display increasingly mixed genetic signatures that reflect sustained contact and intermarriage between different groups. This temporal pattern indicates that demographic integration was a gradual process that required several centuries to achieve complete population mixing. The implications of genetic research for understanding migration versus diffusion models of cultural change extend beyond simple either-or distinctions, to reveal complex processes that combined both mechanisms in different proportions and contexts. The British example demonstrates that substantial migration can occur while still involving cultural exchange and adaptation between incoming and existing populations. The continental European examples show that cultural diffusion can operate effectively without requiring large-scale population movement, but may still involve limited migration by specialised individuals, including craftspeople, traders, or marriage partners. Population genetics research has also revealed the role of demographic expansion in driving Beaker period population movements and cultural spread. Genetic diversity analysis suggests that some Beaker populations experienced rapid demographic growth that created pressure for territorial expansion and resource acquisition. This expansion may have been facilitated by technological innovations, including improved agricultural techniques, bronze metallurgy, and more efficient transportation methods that enabled larger populations to be sustained in existing territories while also supporting colonization of new regions. The demographic expansion model helps explain the rapid spread of Beaker culture across Europe and the substantial population movements documented in regions like Britain. Growing populations in core Beaker regions may have generated surplus individuals who sought new territories and opportunities in peripheral areas. The technological advantages associated with Beaker culture, including superior weapons, tools, and agricultural techniques, may have provided competitive advantages that enabled successful colonization and integration into new regions. Genetic analysis of disease resistance and adaptation provides insights into the selective pressures that operated during Beaker period population movements and demographic changes. Populations that migrated to new regions encountered different disease environments and environmental challenges that required genetic adaptation for successful establishment. The genetic signatures of Beaker populations reveal evidence for selection related to lactose tolerance, immune system function, and other traits that influence survival and reproduction in new environments. Lactose tolerance, which enables adults to digest milk products, shows increased frequency in Beaker populations compared to preceding Neolithic groups in many regions. This genetic adaptation provided nutritional advantages for populations that practiced intensive dairy farming and may have contributed to demographic success and population expansion. The geographic distribution of lactose tolerance alleles correlates with evidence for cattle-focused pastoralism in Beaker communities, suggesting co-evolution between genetic adaptation and cultural practices. The relationship between genetic diversity and cultural innovation emerges as another important aspect of beaker population dynamics that influenced technological development and cultural change. Populations with higher genetic diversity resulting from a mixture between different source groups may have possessed greater cultural diversity and innovation potential through combination of different knowledge systems and technological traditions. The genetic evidence for substantial admixture in many beaker populations suggests that cultural mixing accompanied biological mixing and may have contributed to the rapid pace of innovation during this period. Network analysis of genetic relationships between beaker populations reveals complex patterns of connectivity that reflect both geographic proximity and cultural relationships. Populations separated by substantial geographic distances sometimes show closer genetic relationships than geographically adjacent groups, indicating that cultural networks and migration routes did not always follow simple geographic patterns. Rivers, mountain passes, and coastal routes created corridors for movement and contact that connected distant regions while bypassing intervening territories. The genetic evidence for population structure during the Beaker period demonstrates that demographic processes operated at multiple scales from local community organisation to continent-wide migration networks. Local populations maintained distinct genetic signatures that reflected regional histories and marriage patterns, while participating in broader networks that facilitated long-distance movement and cultural exchange. This hierarchical organisation enabled both local adaptation and participation in wider cultural and economic systems. Ancient DNA research continues to reveal new aspects of beaker population dynamics as improved extraction techniques and analytical methods enable investigation of previously inaccessible samples and genetic markers. Whole genome sequencing of beaker individuals provides unprecedented resolution for understanding population relationships, migration patterns, and selective pressures that operated during this crucial period of European prehistory. These advances promise to further refine our understanding of the complex demographic processes that shape the transition from Neolithic to Bronze Age societies across Europe. The sophisticated genetic networks and complex population dynamics that had sustained beaker culture across Europe for over 6 centuries began experiencing fundamental disruptions around 2000 BC as environmental pressures, technological innovations, and shifting social priorities combined to transform the cultural landscape that had dominated the late 3rd millennium. Archaeological evidence from sites across Europe reveals that the distinctive beaker assemblages that had maintained remarkable consistency across vast geographic distances gradually gave way to more regionalised cultural expressions that emphasised local traditions over the pan-European connections that had characterised the height of beaker influence. This transformation did not occur as a sudden collapse, but rather through gradual processes that saw individual elements of beaker culture persist, adapt, and merge with emerging Bronze Age traditions in ways that varied significantly across different European regions. The environmental context for this cultural transformation included climatic changes that affected agricultural productivity and settlement stability across much of Europe during the late 3rd millennium BC. Paleoclimatic data from lake sediments, peat bogs, and glacial ice cores reveals a period of increased climatic variability around 2200 to 1800 BC that brought cooler temperatures, altered precipitation patterns, and more frequent extreme weather events to many regions. These changes challenged established agricultural systems and settlement patterns that had supported beaker communities for centuries, forcing adaptations that often favoured local solutions over the standardised practices that had characterised earlier beaker culture. In Britain, evidence for climatic deterioration appears in peat bog sequences that record increased wetness and cooler conditions beginning around 2200 BC. These changes affected upland regions particularly severely, forcing abandonment of marginal agricultural areas and concentration of settlement in more favourable lowland locations. Archaeological sites in the Peak District and other highland areas show clear evidence for settlement abandonment during this period, with many sites containing final occupation layers dating to the early 2nd millennium BC, followed by sterile deposits indicating site abandonment. The impact of these environmental changes on Beaker communities extended beyond simple agricultural challenges to affect the trade networks and social relationships that had sustained their distinctive cultural practices. Copper mining operations in regions like the Great Orme in Wales and Ross Island in Ireland show evidence for reduced activity or temporary abandonment during the early 2nd millennium BC, possibly reflecting both environmental challenges and changing demand patterns as bronze technology replaced pure copper implements across most of Europe. Technological innovations during the early 2nd millennium BC fundamentally altered the metallurgical landscape that had provided foundations for Beaker prestige systems and trade networks. The development of reliable bronze production techniques that consistently combined copper with tin in optimal proportions created alloys superior to pure copper in hardness, durability, and casting properties. These improvements enabled production of more sophisticated tools and weapons, while reducing dependence on the high-quality copper sources that had sustained earlier Beaker trade networks. The transition from copper to bronze technology required different procurement strategies and production techniques that favoured larger-scale, more centralised manufacturing operations over the distributed craft production that had characterised much of the Beaker period. Bronze casting demanded precise temperature control, proper alloy composition, and sophisticated mould-making techniques that required specialised knowledge and equipment available only to skilled craftspeople with access to adequate workshop facilities and raw material supplies. Regional bronze production centres emerged across Europe during the early 2nd millennium BC, creating new patterns of technological specialisation and trade relationships that differed substantially from earlier Beaker networks. The Onetis culture in Central Europe developed particularly sophisticated bronze production techniques that enabled manufacture of standardized implements for wide distribution through established trade routes. Archaeological evidence from Onetis workshops reveals coordinated production systems that created consistent product types and quality standards for regional and international markets. Similarly, the Wessex culture in southern Britain established bronze production capabilities that combined local copper sources with imported tin to create implements that exceeded earlier Beaker metalwork in both quality and quantity. The rich burial assemblages from sites like Bush Barrow demonstrate access to bronze implements of extraordinary sophistication, including daggers with complex hilting arrangements and decorative elements that required advanced metallurgical knowledge and artistic skill to produce. These technological advances created new forms of social differentiation that emphasize control over bronze production and distribution, rather than the broader craft specializations that had characterized Beaker elites. Successful bronze producers accumulated wealth and influence through their ability to supply superior implements to communities across wide geographic areas, creating social hierarchies based on technological control rather than the more diverse prestige systems that had operated during the Beaker period. The transformation of burial practices during the early 2nd millennium BC reflected these changing social priorities while maintaining certain elements of individual burial ideology that had been central to Beaker culture. Single burial remained the dominant mortuary practice across most of Europe, but the specific assemblages and architectural elements began emphasizing different aspects of social identity and cultural affiliation than had characterized earlier Beaker traditions. Weapon burials became increasingly elaborate during this transition period, with bronze daggers, axes and spears replacing the copper implements and archery equipment that had dominated earlier Beaker male graves. These new weapon assemblages reflected changing military technologies and combat techniques that emphasized close-quarters fighting with bronze implements, rather than the archery-focused warfare that had characterized much of the Beaker period. The famous Migdale Marnock tradition in northern Scotland exemplifies this transformation, featuring burials with distinctive bronze implements including flat axes, daggers, and spears that demonstrated technological sophistication while maintaining certain decorative elements derived from earlier Beaker traditions. These assemblages appeared in burial contexts that preserved individual burial ideology while adapting grave goods selections to reflect changing technological capabilities and social priorities. Female burial assemblages during this transition period showed similar patterns of continuity and change, with jewellery and ornamental items becoming more elaborate while maintaining certain stylistic connections to earlier Beaker traditions. Bronze pins, dress fasteners, and decorative items replaced many of the copper and gold ornaments that had characterised earlier female graves, reflecting both technological advances and changing aesthetic preferences that emphasised different forms of personal display and social signalling. Pottery traditions experienced particularly dramatic transformations during the decline of the distinctive Beaker culture, as the standardised vessel forms and decorative schemes that had maintained remarkable consistency across Europe gave way to more regionalised ceramic traditions that emphasised local preferences and technological innovations. The characteristic bell-shaped profile that had defined Beaker pottery for centuries gradually disappeared from most European regions, replaced by new vessel forms that reflected different functional requirements and aesthetic sensibilities. Food vessels in Britain represent one of the most distinctive regional developments that emerged from the transformation of Beaker pottery traditions. These vessels featured enlarged capacities and modified rim forms that suggested different serving practices and dietary preferences than had characterised earlier Beaker communities. The decorative schemes also changed substantially, with geometric patterns giving way to more naturalistic motifs and different surface treatment techniques that reflected evolving artistic traditions and cultural values. Collared urns developed as another distinctive British ceramic tradition that maintained certain connections to Beaker decorative techniques, while adapting vessel forms for new functional requirements, particularly cremation burial practices that became increasingly common during the early 2nd millennium BC. These vessels featured distinctive collar rims and geometric decoration that preserved certain Beaker artistic elements, while adapting ceramic technology for different ritual and domestic purposes. Continental European pottery traditions showed similar patterns of regional diversification that built upon established Beaker technological foundations, while developing new stylistic characteristics suited to local preferences and functional requirements. The Aenetis culture developed distinctive ceramic traditions that combined certain Beaker decorative techniques with new vessel forms and firing methods that reflected changing technological capabilities and cultural priorities. Tumulus culture pottery in Central Europe demonstrated clear technological continuity with earlier Beaker traditions, while developing new decorative schemes and vessel forms that reflected changing social organisation and ritual practices. These ceramics featured sophisticated surface treatments and geometric patterns that preserved certain Beaker artistic elements, while adapting ceramic technology for different cultural contexts and functional requirements. Settlement patterns during the transition period reflected changing defensive priorities and resource management strategies that differed substantially from earlier Beaker approaches to landscape organisation and territorial control. Hill forts and defended settlements became increasingly common across much of Europe during the early 2nd millennium BC, suggesting heightened conflict levels and territorial competition that required different approaches to community security and resource protection. The emergence of fortified settlements reflected changing military technologies and combat techniques that emphasised collective defence over the individual warrior traditions that had characterised much of the Beaker period. Bronze Age fortifications featured sophisticated defensive works, including multiple ditches, palisades, and stone walls that required coordinated construction efforts and community-wide commitment to defensive preparations. Wessex culture settlements in southern Britain exemplify these changing patterns, with evidence for increased settlement nucleation and defensive construction that differed substantially from earlier Beaker dispersed settlement patterns. Archaeological excavations at sites like South Lodge demonstrate complex defensive works and coordinated settlement planning that reflected changing social organisation and security concerns during the transition period. Trade network reorganisation during the early 2nd millennium BC created new patterns of cultural exchange that differed substantially from the pan-European connections that had characterised the height of Beaker culture. Regional exchange systems became increasingly important as communities focused on developing relationships with nearby groups that shared similar environmental conditions and resource requirements, rather than maintaining the long-distance connections that had sustained earlier beaker networks. The decline of certain prestigious materials in archaeological assemblages reflects these changing trade priorities and cultural values. Jet objects from Yorkshire, which had circulated widely during the Beaker period, became less common in distant regions as communities focused on acquiring materials and products from more accessible sources. Similarly, the distribution of Grand Pressigny flint contracted substantially during the early 2nd millennium BC as communities developed alternative sources for high-quality stone tools. However, certain trade relationships intensified during this transition period, particularly those involving bronze production materials and finished implements. Tin sources in Cornwall and Brittany became increasingly important as bronze technology spread across Europe, creating new forms of long-distance exchange that differed from earlier beaker trade networks in their focus on specific technological requirements rather than broader cultural connections. Religious and ritual transformations during the decline of beaker culture reflected changing cosmological beliefs and social organisation, while maintaining certain ceremonial traditions that had been central to earlier beaker communities. The continued use of established sacred sites like Stonehenge and Avebury demonstrates respect for ancestral traditions while adapting ceremonial practices to meet changing religious and social requirements. Cremation burial became increasingly common across much of Europe during the early 2nd millennium BC, representing fundamental changes in beliefs about death and afterlife that differed substantially from the individual inhumation practices that had characterised most of the Beaker period. This transformation required different ritual equipment and ceremonial procedures that influenced pottery production, settlement organisation, and landscape use in ways that contributed to the broader cultural changes occurring during this transition period. The development of round barrow cemeteries in Britain exemplifies these changing ritual practices, with evidence for coordinated burial programs that created new forms of territorial organisation and ancestral commemoration. These cemeteries featured multiple burial mounds arranged in planned configurations that reflected changing social hierarchies and territorial relationships, while maintaining certain connections to earlier Beaker individual burial traditions. Regional cultural developments during the early 2nd millennium BC created distinctive archaeological traditions that preserved certain Beaker elements while developing new characteristics suited to local conditions and preferences. The Armorican Bronze Age culture in Brittany maintained strong metallurgical traditions derived from earlier Beaker innovations, while developing distinctive pottery styles and burial practices that reflected local cultural preferences and environmental adaptations. Nordic Bronze Age culture in Scandinavia similarly preserved certain technological and artistic elements from earlier Beaker traditions, while developing distinctive cultural characteristics including elaborate rock art traditions, sophisticated bronze working techniques, and unique burial practices that reflected local cultural development and environmental adaptation. These regional developments demonstrate that the decline of distinctive Beaker culture did not represent cultural collapse or technological regression, but rather transformation and adaptation that preserved valuable innovations while developing new approaches suited to changing conditions and requirements. The technological foundations established during the Beaker period provided essential knowledge for subsequent Bronze Age developments, while the social innovations, including individual burial practices and craft specialization, continued to influence European societies for centuries to come. The legacy of Beaker culture extended far beyond the specific pottery styles and burial practices that had defined the archaeological phenomenon to encompass fundamental, technological, social, and cultural innovations that would characterize European Bronze Age societies throughout the second millennium BC. Metallurgical knowledge, craft specialization, individual burial ideology, and long-distance trade relationships all represented crucial developments that emerged during the Beaker period and continued to influence subsequent cultural developments across Europe. The technological foundations established during the Beaker period and continue to influence subsequent cultural developments across Europe represented far more than the specific pottery styles and burial practices that had initially defined this archaeological phenomenon for early researchers. As the distinctive bell-shaped vessels gradually disappeared from the archaeological record during the early second millennium BC, the fundamental innovations in metallurgy, social organisation, and cultural transmission that had emerged during the Beaker period became permanently integrated into European Bronze Age societies. Modern archaeological interpretation has undergone dramatic transformations since the early culture-historical approaches of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, evolving through successive theoretical frameworks that have fundamentally altered our understanding of what the Beaker phenomenon actually represented and how it operated across prehistoric Europe. The culture-historical approach that dominated archaeological interpretation from the 1880s through the 1960s viewed the Beaker phenomenon primarily through the lens of migration and ethnic identity, treating the distinctive pottery styles as markers of specific population groups who had moved across Europe carrying their cultural traditions to new territories. German archaeologist Gustav Kusinner's influential work established theoretical foundations that directly linked material culture with ethnic groups, leading to interpretations that emphasized invasion, conquest, and population replacement as primary mechanisms of cultural change. This approach generated migration maps showing arrows radiating from presumed homeland regions to explain the distribution of Beaker assemblages across Europe, creating narratives of warrior peoples who imposed their superior technology and social organisation on existing Neolithic populations. British archaeologist Gordon Child's synthetic works during the mid-20th century refined these migration models while maintaining their essential character, proposing that Beaker culture represented the spread of a warrior aristocracy, who introduced metallurgy and individual burial practices to European communities that had previously lacked these innovations. Child's influential writings emphasized the revolutionary character of Beaker innovations while preserving the fundamental assumption that cultural change resulted primarily from population movement rather than indigenous development or cultural diffusion through existing social networks. The processual archaeology movement that emerged during the 1960s and 1970s fundamentally challenged these culture-historical interpretations by emphasizing economic and environmental factors over ethnic identity and population movement as primary drivers of cultural change. Lewis Binford and other processual theorists argued that archaeological assemblages reflected adaptive responses to environmental conditions and economic opportunities, rather than ethnic markers carried by migrating populations. This theoretical shift redirected attention toward understanding the functional relationships between material culture, subsistence strategies, and environmental conditions that had shaped Beaker cultural development. Processual interpretations of the Beaker phenomenon emphasized the role of technological innovation, particularly metallurgy, as a catalyst for social and economic transformations that created new forms of specialization, exchange, and social differentiation across Europe. Colin Renfrew's influential work on European prehistory proposed that Beaker culture represented an interaction sphere that facilitated the transmission of metallurgical knowledge and social innovations through existing trade networks without necessarily involving substantial population movement. This interpretation shifted focus from migration narratives toward understanding the economic and social mechanisms that enabled rapid cultural transmission across vast geographic distances. Environmental archaeology emerged as another crucial component of processual approaches, emphasizing the relationship between cultural change and climatic fluctuations, agricultural development, and resource availability. Studies of pollen sequences, soil chemistry, and settlement patterns revealed complex relationships between environmental conditions and cultural adaptations that provided new perspectives on beaker settlement strategies, subsistence practices, and technological choices. These investigations demonstrated that beaker communities had developed sophisticated understanding of local environmental conditions and had adapted their cultural practices to maximize resource exploitation while maintaining sustainable relationships with their landscapes. Post-processual archaeology that developed during the 1980s and 1990s introduced additional theoretical perspectives that emphasized symbolic meaning, individual agency, and cultural identity as crucial factors in understanding prehistoric societies. Ian Hodder and other post-processual theorists argued that material culture carried symbolic meanings that reflected complex belief systems, social relationships, and cultural values that could not be reduced to simple functional or economic explanations. This theoretical approach encouraged investigation of beaker pottery decoration, burial practices, and settlement organization as expressions of cultural identity and social ideology, rather than purely practical responses to environmental or economic conditions. Post-processual interpretations of beaker culture emphasize the active role of individuals and communities in creating and maintaining cultural traditions through daily practices, ritual activities, and social interactions. These approaches highlighted the diversity and complexity of beaker cultural expressions across different regions and time periods, challenging earlier assumptions about cultural uniformity and standardization. Regional variations in pottery styles, burial practices, and settlement patterns became subjects of detailed investigation aimed at understanding how local communities adapted broader beaker traditions to their specific cultural preferences and environmental conditions. Current debates regarding the nature of beaker identity reflect the influence of these successive theoretical developments, while incorporating new evidence from genetic research, isotope analysis, and other scientific techniques that were unavailable to earlier generations of archaeologists. The fundamental question of whether beaker culture represented an ethnic group, cultural package, or social network remains contentious, with different researchers emphasizing different aspects of the archaeological and genetic evidence to support competing interpretations. The ethnic group interpretation maintains that beaker culture represented a specific population with shared genetic ancestry, language, and cultural traditions who migrated across Europe during the 3rd millennium BC. Proponents of this view point to genetic evidence for substantial population turnover in regions like Britain, where ancient DNA analysis reveals replacement of approximately 90% of the Neolithic gene pool by populations with continental European ancestry. The correlation between genetic change and cultural transformation in these regions supports arguments that beaker culture spread primarily through population movement rather than cultural diffusion. However, critics of the ethnic group interpretation argue that the genetic evidence reveals much more complex patterns of population interaction that included substantial regional variation in the relationship between genetic ancestry and cultural practices. The presence of individuals with local Neolithic ancestry in beaker burial contexts, combined with evidence for cultural continuity in many regions, suggests that beaker identity could be acquired through social mechanisms rather than inherited through biological descent. These observations support alternative interpretations that emphasize cultural adoption and adaptation over population replacement. The cultural package interpretation proposes that beaker culture represented a coherent set of technological innovations, social practices, and symbolic systems that spread through existing European populations without necessarily involving substantial migration. This view emphasizes the functional advantages of beaker innovations, including metallurgy, archery technology, and individual burial practices that could be adopted by existing communities to enhance their economic capabilities and social organization. The rapid spread of beaker traditions across diverse environmental and cultural contexts supports arguments that these innovations provided adaptive advantages that encourage their adoption regardless of population origins. Proponents of the cultural package interpretation point to evidence for technological continuity and gradual cultural change in many regions where beaker traditions appeared alongside existing practices before eventually becoming dominant. The preservation of local architectural traditions, subsistence practices, and settlement patterns in many areas suggests that beaker adoption occurred through selective cultural borrowing rather than wholesale replacement of existing traditions. This interpretation emphasizes the agency of local communities in choosing which aspects of beaker culture to adopt and how to integrate them with existing practices. The social network interpretation represents a synthesis of migration and diffusion models that emphasizes the role of established trade relationships, marriage alliances, and social connections in facilitating both population movement and cultural transmission. This approach recognizes that both demographic change and cultural diffusion operated simultaneously, but with different relative importance in different regions and contexts. The complexity of genetic patterns across Europe supports arguments that beaker expansion involved multiple mechanisms operating through existing social networks, rather than simple linear migration from a single homeland. Social network interpretations emphasize the role of individual mobility, craft specialization, and elite exchange relationships in creating connections between distant communities that facilitated both cultural transmission and population movement. The evidence for long-distance travel by individuals buried with beaker assemblages, combined with the distribution of exotic materials and specialized craft products, demonstrates that beaker communities participated in extensive networks that enabled rapid communication and exchange across vast geographic distances. The contribution of beaker peoples to the foundation of Bronze Age European civilization extends far beyond the specific cultural practices that define their archaeological visibility to encompass fundamental technological, social, and economic innovations that shaped European development for millennia. Metallurgical knowledge developed during the Beaker period provided essential foundations for subsequent bronze production techniques that dominated European technology throughout the second millennium BC. The sophisticated understanding of copper extraction, alloy composition, and casting techniques that emerged during the Beaker period enabled the technological advances that characterized later Bronze Age societies. Social innovations, including individual burial practices, craft specialization, and social stratification that developed during the Beaker period, established organizational principles that continue to influence European societies long after distinctive beaker assemblages had disappeared from the archaeological record. The emphasis on individual achievement and material accumulation that characterized beaker burial practices represented fundamental departures from earlier collective ideologies that established precedents for subsequent European social development. Trade network organization and long-distance exchange relationships that emerged during the Beaker period created infrastructure for European commerce that persisted through subsequent cultural developments. Transportation routes, exchange mechanisms, and trusted relationships between distant communities that had been established during the Beaker period provided foundations for expanded Bronze Age trade systems that connected European societies with Mediterranean and Near Eastern civilizations. Ongoing research directions continue to refine our understanding of the Beaker phenomenon through innovative analytical techniques and theoretical approaches that were unavailable to earlier generations of archaeologists. Isotope analysis of human remains provides increasingly detailed information about individual mobility patterns, dietary practices, and childhood origins that reveal complex patterns of population movement and cultural interaction. Strontium isotope analysis of tooth enamel enables identification of migrants and their regions of origin, while carbon and nitrogen isotope analysis of bone collagen provides information about dietary practices and subsistence strategies. Experimental archaeology has emerged as a crucial research tool that provides insights into beaker technological processes, craft production techniques, and functional capabilities of archaeological assemblages. Experimental pottery production reveals the specialized knowledge and time investments required to create high-quality beaker vessels, while metallurgical experiments demonstrate the sophisticated understanding of temperature control, alloy composition, and casting techniques that characterize beaker metalworking. These studies provide essential data for understanding the economic and social implications of craft specialization during the Beaker period. Landscape studies utilizing geographic information systems, remote sensing, and environmental modeling provide new perspectives on beaker settlement strategies, territorial organization, and resource management practices. These approaches enable investigation of relationships between settlement location, resource availability, and transportation routes that reveal sophisticated understanding of landscape utilization and territorial control. Predictive modelling based on environmental variables and archaeological site distributions helps identify areas with high potential for undiscovered beaker sites while providing insights into settlement decision-making processes. Advances in ancient DNA extraction and analysis continue to revolutionize understanding of beaker population dynamics and genetic relationships. Whole genome sequencing of beaker individuals provides unprecedented resolution for understanding population structure, migration patterns, and selective pressures that operated during this crucial period. These techniques enable investigation of kinship relationships within burial groups, population size estimates, and demographic processes that shaped beaker cultural development. The integration of multiple analytical approaches, including archaeological excavation, scientific analysis, and theoretical interpretation, continues to reveal new aspects of beaker culture, while refining existing knowledge about this crucial period in European prehistory. The sophisticated understanding that has emerged from decades of research demonstrates that the beaker phenomenon represented one of the most complex and influential cultural developments in European prehistory, establishing technological, social, and economic foundations that would shape European civilization for millennia to come. The enduring legacy of the Beaker peoples lies not in the distinctive pottery vessels that first attracted archaeological attention, but in the fundamental transformations in technology, social organization, and cultural transmission that they pioneered across Bronze Age Europe. Their innovations in metallurgy established the technological foundations for European Bronze Age civilization, while their development of individual burial practices and social stratification created organizational principles that would influence European societies throughout antiquity. The extensive trade networks and cultural exchange systems that they established provided infrastructure for European commerce and communication that persisted long after their distinctive material culture had evolved into new forms. Modern archaeological understanding of the Beaker phenomenon continues to evolve as new analytical techniques and theoretical approaches reveal additional aspects of this remarkable cultural development. But the fundamental importance of Beaker contributions to European civilization remains undisputed. The story of the Beaker peoples represents a crucial chapter in the broader narrative of European prehistory, demonstrating how technological innovation, social adaptation, and cultural transmission combine to create lasting changes that shape the trajectory of European development from the Bronze Age through subsequent millennia.